Welcome, the Dweller of the Dark. We are a channel honoring the yellowed and blackened bones of many prominent authors. We will be digging up several obscure, strange, and forgotten authors who influenced many of the great horror, science fiction, and fantasy writers today. Comment below if you like. If you have authors that you'd like to see recognized, list them in the comments or contact our author page. Subscribe for more tales of the horrifying, obscure, strange, and forgotten. We'll have quite a collection climbing out of the tombs. If you like any of our tales, comment, ring the bell, and crush the like button below. Unknown Horror Masters. The Skull and Bones collection has risen from the grave. More beasts to be released soon. Find us on Fiverr to raise 7 kinds of hell. Check out our other stories on our websites. YouTube, BitChute, Rumble, Dweller of the Dark. Official website, dwellerofthedark.com. Kindle Vella, new serialized novels and novelette. Weekly new episodes. Check out links below for Where the Wolf Dwells. The Curious Death of Dionysus Chenault. Our books and ebooks are on Kindle Amazon. Follow, support us on Twitter, Instagram, Patreon, Bandcamp. Dweller of the Dark, Children of Horror, Legion of Ghouls. Tonight, we continue our celebration of Halloween. Each night, we will be presenting tales of the best Halloween horrors ever conjured to terrify, haunt, and delight. If a werewolf is slain as a man, then his half-soul will haunt his slayer forever. In the Forest of Villefere by Robert E. Howard. The sun had set. The great shadows came striding over the forest. In the weird twilight of a late summer day, I saw the path ahead glide on among the mighty trees and disappear. And I shuddered and glanced fearfully over my shoulder. Miles behind lay the nearest village, miles ahead the next. I looked to left and to right as I strode on, and anon I looked behind me, and anon I stopped short, grasping my rapier as a breaking twig betokened the going of some small beast. Or was it a beast? But the path led on, and I followed, because, forsooth, I had naught else to do. As I went, I bethought me, my own thoughts will rout me if I be not aware. What is there in this forest, except perhaps the creatures that roam it, deer and the like? Tush! The foolish legends of those villagers. And so I went, and the twilight faded into dusk. Stars began to blink, and the leaves of the trees murmured in the faint breeze. And then I stopped short, my sword leaping to my hand. For just ahead, around the curve of the path, someone was singing. The words I could not distinguish, but the accent was strange. Almost barbaric. I stepped behind a great tree, and the cold sweat beaded my forehead. Then the singer came in sight, a tall, thin man, vague in the twilight. I shrugged my shoulders. A man I did not fear. I sprang out, my point raised. Stand! He showed no surprise. I prithee handle thy blade with care, friend, he said. Somewhat ashamed, I lowered my sword. I am new to this forest, I quoth apologetically. I heard talk of bandits, I crave pardon. Where lies the road to Villefere? Corbleu, you've missed it, he answered. You should have branched off to the right some distance back. I'm going there myself. If you may abide my company, I will direct you. I hesitated. Yet why should I hesitate? Why, certainly. My name is the Mentor of Normandy. And I am Carolus Leloup. No, I started back. He looked at me in astonishment. Pardon? Said I. The name is strange. Does not loup mean wolf? My family were always great hunters, he answered. He did not offer his hand. You will pardon my staring, said I as we walked down the path. But I can hardly see your face in the dusk. I sensed that he was laughing, though he made no sound. It is little to look upon, he answered. I stepped closer and then leaped away, my hair bristling. A mask, I exclaimed. Why do you wear a mask, monsieur? It is a vow, he explained. In fleeing a pack of hounds, I vowed that if I escaped, I would wear a mask for a certain time. Hounds, monsieur? Wolves, he answered quickly. I said wolves. We walked in silence for a while, and then my companion said, I am surprised that you walk these woods by night. Few people come these ways, even in the day. I am in haste to reach the border, I answered. A treaty has been signed with the English, and the Duke of Burgundy should know of it. The people at the village sought to dissuade me. They spoke of a wolf that was purported to roam these woods. Here the path branches to Villefere, said he, and I saw a narrow, crooked path that I had not seen when I passed it before. It led in amid the darkness of the trees. I shuddered. You wish to return to the village? No, I exclaimed. No, no! Lead on. So narrow was the path that we walked single file, he leading. I looked well at him. He was taller, much taller than I, and thin, wiry. He was dressed in a costume that smacked of Spain. A long rapier swung at his hip. He walked with long, easy strides, noiselessly. Then he began to talk of travel and adventure. He spoke of many lands and seas he had seen and many strange things. So we talked and went farther and farther into the forest. I presumed that he was French, and yet he had a very strange accent that was neither French nor Spanish nor English, nor like any language I had ever heard. Some words he slurred strangely, and some he could not pronounce at all. This path is not often used, is it? I asked. Not by many, he answered, and laughed silently. I shuddered. It was very dark, and the leaves whispered together among the branches. A fiend haunts this forest, I said. So the peasants say, he answered, but I have roamed it oft, and have never seen his face. Then he began to speak of strange creatures of darkness, and the moon rose, and shadows glided among the trees. He looked up at the moon. Haste, said he. We must reach our destination before the moon reaches her zenith. We hurried along the trail. They say, said I, that a werewolf haunts these woodlands. It might be, said he, and we argued much upon the subject. The old women say, said he, that if a werewolf is slain while a wolf, then he is slain. But if he is slain as a man, then his half-soul will haunt his slayer forever. But haste thee, the moon nears her zenith. We came into a small moonlit glade, and the stranger stopped.
"Let us pause a while," said he.
"Nay, let us be gone," I urged. "I like not this place." He laughed without sound.
"Why," said he, "this is a fair glade, as good as a banquet hall it is, and many times have I feasted here.
Ha ha ha!
Look ye, I will show you a dance."
And he began bounding here and there, anon flinging back his head and laughing silently. Thought I, the man is mad. As he danced his weird dance, I looked about me. The trail went not on, but stopped in the glade. "Come," said I, "we must on. Do you not smell the rank, hairy scent that hovers about the glade? Wolves den here. Perhaps they are about us and are gliding upon us even now." He dropped upon all fours, bounded higher than my head, and came toward me with a strange slinking motion.
"That dance is called the dance of the wolf," said he,
and my hair bristled. "Keep off!" I stepped back, and with a screech that set the echoes shuddering, he leaped for me, and though a sword hung at his belt, he did not draw it. My rapier was half out when he grasped my arm and flung me headlong. I dragged him with me, and we struck the ground together. Wrenching a hand free, I jerked off the mask. A shriek of horror broke from my lips. Beast eyes glittered beneath that mask. White fangs flashed in the moonlight. The face was that of a wolf. In an instant, those fangs were at my throat. Taloned hands tore the sword from my grasp. I beat at that horrible face with my clenched fist, but his jaws were fastened on my shoulder. His talons tore at my throat. Then I was on my back. The world was fading. Blindly, I struck out. My hand dropped, then closed automatically about the hilt of my dagger, which I had been unable to get at. I drew and stabbed. A terrible, half-bestial bellowing screech. Then I reeled to my feet free. At my feet lay the werewolf. I stooped, raised the dagger, then paused, looked up. The moon hovered close to her zenith. If I slew the thing as a man, its frightful spirit would haunt me forever. I sat down waiting. The thing watched me with flaming wolf eyes. The long wiry limbs seemed to shrink, to crook. Hair seemed to grow upon them. Fearing madness, I snatched up the thing's own sword and hacked it to pieces. Then I flung the sword away and fled. The Silver Knife by Ralphallanlang. A shivery tale of Wolf Dahlgren and his gruesome adventure with a great wolf that trailed him through the Arctic waste. When Ross Nagel returned in less than a fortnight from his first manhunt in the uniform of a Northwest mounted policeman, it was a matter of surprise to all who witnessed his return to barracks. It was not that anyone doubted his ability, for he came to the Mounties with an enviable service record in His Majesty's troops in the Far East. The surprise was due to the fact that he had been assigned to the trail of Wolf Dahlgren, a veritable wolf of the North, whose familiar ground constituted no less than 1,000 square miles of frozen waste. Still more surprised was the post commander when Nagel, in making his report, laid before him a package containing 2 curious articles. The first of these was well calculated to inspire the astonishment with which the inspector regarded it. It was a knife of falchion shape, with a wicked curve at the point that suggested the purpose for which it had originally been made, a sacrificial knife. In the eyes of the inspector, this impression was further confirmed by the material of which it was made, beaten silver, and by the pair of great twin rubies that ornamented the hilt. He had once seen a knife almost exactly similar to it while attached as guard to an expedition excavating the ruins of an ancient temple of Dagon. But what could such a knife, with its priceless inset gems, be doing here in the Arctic wastes of North America? Only one explanation presented itself to the puzzled mind of the inspector: that it had been brought by an immigrating Old World tribe in some dim period of history when the continents were still connected by a strip of land. A remnant of this tribe might conceivably still exist in the unexplored regions of the North, the sacred knife having been handed down from generation to generation. How had Wolf Dahlgren gained possession of it while under pursuit by the Mounties on a murder charge? He turned his attention to the other article on the desk, a small, leather-bound notebook, in hopes that it might furnish an explanation. It was in good condition, except for bloodstains on the cover, legibly written, and the inspector leaned back to read. The first entry was dated 2 weeks previously. December 3rd. With this entry, I begin another diary, one of a long series written to be destroyed, that have solaced the loneliness of 3 years spent on Arctic trails. It is lonely here in Camp the Night, with the nearest white settlement 200 miles away, and a hard day's trailing from the native village where I passed the last week. If luck stays with me, this will be my last trek through this bitter, accursed country, and luck at last is coming my way. After 3 years of freezing, starving, and murdering miserable creatures for contemptible amounts, luck puts me in possession of a treasure more valuable than any gold mine in the north. The simple Indian fools who used the silver knife in their sacrificial service could have no idea of the value of the great rubies in its hilt. To them, it is merely a religious relic handed down from long-forgotten ancestors. To me, it is freedom, life, luxury, the silver key of desire. It is right and just that I should have the knife. Who have so much better use for it than any the old sachem ever put it to? They will not have missed it until twilight tonight, and no Indians will cover as much trail in 2 days as the one I have left behind me today. In less than 2 weeks, I will hit the seacoast, then for a ship to the States, and the Mounties can have their north. December 4th. Another good day's trailing, bettering perhaps the distance made yesterday. Nothing of interest has occurred, and I have seen no living thing except a skulking timber wolf. It is remarkable in that it is the largest I have ever seen. A great, shaggy brute, standing inches higher than any of my huskies, and it seems to be following me. Doubtless, it is beginning to feel the pinch of winter hunger. December 5th. An astounding thing occurred last night, unparalleled in all of my experience in the north. An attack by a wolf or wolves on a camp protected by an open fire. It was well after midnight, and due to the fact that I was sleeping more soundly than usual,
the fire had subsided almost into a bed of coals when I was jarred awake by a sharp yelp from the dogs, followed by the snarling fury of a fight. It could not be called a fight either, for the wolf or wolves were gone again into the night as swiftly as they had come, and I had only a brief glimpse of one shaggy giant as he faded into the obscurity of the darkness. But brief as the engagement was, its effect was devastating to my team, the lead dog having been literally torn to ribbons and another slashed on the shoulder. As a consequence, I was able to make but poor time today, and I had trouble constantly with the dogs, so demoralized is their condition. What puzzles me is that the attackers seemed to make no effort to obtain food, but I suppose that my awakening frightened them away. I have seen the lone wolf several times today, dogging my trail at an uncomfortably close distance. On one occasion, I was close enough to see his devilish fangs as he stood and snarled his hatred. 2 clear shots I had at him before he retreated, and I am unable to explain how I could have missed him. I have seen no other wolves at any time, and am almost forced to believe that it was he alone who made the attack last night, although it seems impossible that one wolf could wreak such havoc. Tonight, I will keep a sharp watch to prevent a repetition of it. December 6th. The wolf was back last night, and despite all of my precautions, took toll of another of my dogs. I was sleeping lightly with my rifle at the ready, and was up at the first sound, getting my first close sight of him as he raised his bloody fangs from the husky's throat and turned to face me. He must have stood nearly 3 feet high, but it was the ghoulish fury in his yellow eyes that unnerved me more than his great stature. I fired point blank at the hideous head, but still he stood there fixing me with that baleful glare, and it was not until the pack closed in on his flank that he turned and looked away. 3 dogs only are left of my original 5, and these are so demoralized with terror that I can make but poor headway. I, too, own myself a victim of intense nervousness and am weighted down by an uncanny, unreasonable feeling of dread. If I were more susceptible to superstitious beliefs, I might find myself imagining all sorts of weird explanations of my failure to drop him at point blank with a rifle that has brought down moose. As it is, though I take no stock in werewolf tales, my mental condition is such that I would not be above trying a silver bullet on him if I had one, merely to relieve my nerves. December 7th. The thing was back again last night, but this time he appeared in a different manner. He is bold now, and appeared as soon as dusk had fallen, skulking in the shadows just outside the circle of firelight. 3 hours I sat there, under the spell of those hellish yellow eyes, now appearing on one side of the circle, now on the other, compelling me frequently to change my position in order to watch him. I fired again and again, with no result, except that the eyes moved to another position. Then it happened. Before I knew what had occurred, I was pouring shot after shot into the charging beast until the hammer clicked on an empty chamber. He was so close that the hateful eyes seemed burning through my brain. And in desperate agony, I grasped the only weapon my hand fell upon, the silver knife. What happened then, I do not clearly know, but he swerved away from me, and in some unexplainable way, I sensed fear in his snarl. Then he was among the dogs, ripping and slashing, and a third victim was torn to ribbons. My nerve is shattered, and I scarcely know what to believe. Bullets have no effect on the thing, and I am here in the wilderness, 100 miles from civilization, with no protection against him. I have one hope, founded on the manner in which he avoided me last night. For some reason, he fears me, although I am absolutely helpless before him. My only hope now is to push on to the coast with the 2 dogs I have left, praying that these too may not fall victims before I reach there. December 8th. I am writing this now, not to dispel loneliness or even nervousness, but in sheer terror, and to take my mind off the horror that is prowling outside. It may be the last page of this ghastly tale, for the thing has grown desperate now, and apparently has submerged its fear of me in the greater fear of my reaching civilization and escaping it. Since early morning, I have pushed forward at a killing pace, with the thing growing steadily in confidence or in desperation, and drawing closer to me with every mile. At noon, I reached this abandoned miner's cabin and was able to gain its shelter in just the nick of time. The thing evidently can think, for at sight of the cabin, it threw all caution to the winds and charged, straining me to the utmost to reach the door and forcing me to abandon the dogs. Their cries were pitiful, for so greatly had the terror grown upon them that they did not even try to fight. Watching from a small high window on the north side of the cabin, I was sickened at the savage rending of their bodies and at the ghastly aspect of its bloody snout as it raised its head and gave vent to a blood-chilling howl, the first sound I have heard it utter. I cannot describe the nightmare of horror that closed down on my brain as it rang through the silence, and which has left me completely unmanned. It was minutes before I could pull myself together enough to make a search of the cabin for any means of defense, and then at last luck smiled and gave me a glimmer of hope. Among a collection of useless odds and ends left by the miners, I found an old bullet mold, and the thought has come to me that I may be able to melt enough silver from the knife to run a bullet. Weird and ridiculous as the idea seems, I am convinced that the thing outside can be nothing else than a werewolf, and my only hope is to try a silver bullet, to which alone they are said to be vulnerable. I have pried all of the loose wood obtainable off of the studding and wait now for the fire to burn into coals hot enough to melt the silver. It is almost ready, and I stop now to break a piece from the guard of the knife. All hope of killing the thing is now gone. The wood I have is too dry and lifeless to make a fire hot enough to melt the silver. I must play a waiting game now. For as long as the provisions in my shoulder knapsack hold out, I am safe. In its wolf form, the thing cannot open the door, although I have no way of barring it, and if it assumes human shape, I will kill it with a bullet. It is whining now and scratching against the wall in an effort to rear up high enough to look in the window. Now it is padding back and forth before the door, trying doubtless to work up courage to assume its human form, and there, now, is a hand on the latch. It has been 3 minutes now since the latch was raised. Fear is doubtless holding him back. At any moment, he may conquer it, but I am ready. Hounds of hell! Can it be possible that he is changing back into a wolf again?
There was a strange look on Inspector Moore's face as he raised his eyes in a questioning glance to the face of the constable, who still waited. "Just how did you come into possession of these?" he asked. Nagel's face showed plainly that he too had perused the contents of the diary. "I found them in an abandoned miner's cabin beyond Bitter Creek," he answered slowly. "Wolf Dahlgren was in there, dead, his throat torn as though by the fangs of a wolf. I found this diary on the table beside him. There was another corpse in there too, a wrinkled old Indian whose weird ceremonial garb marked him as some kind of medicine man or sachem. It was in his breast that I found the silver knife."
Wolf's Head
by Robert E. Howard. First published in April 1926 for
Weird Tales. Then the eerie wolf yell rose to the skies,
and the natives broke and fled.
wild shrieks, not of rage, but of terror.
Weird Tales.
Fear? Your pardon, messieurs, but the meaning of fear you do not know. No, I hold to my statement. You are soldiers, adventurers. You have known the charges of regiments, of dragoons, the frenzy of windlashed seas. But fear? Real hair-raising, horror-crawling fear? You have not known. I myself have known such fear. But until the legions of darkness swirl from hell's gate and the world flames to ruin, will never such fear again be known to men. Hark, I will tell you the tale, for it was many years ago and half across the world, and none of you will ever see the man of whom I tell you, or seeing know. Return then with me across the years to a day when I, a reckless young cavalier, stepped from the small boat that had landed me from the ship floating in the harbor, cursed the mud that littered the crude wharf, and strode up the landing toward the castle in answer to the invitation of an old friend, Dom Vincente da Lusto. Dom Vincente was a strange, far-sighted man, a strong man, one who saw visions beyond the ken of his time. In his veins, perhaps, ran the blood of those old Phoenicians who, the priests tell us, ruled the seas and built cities in far lands, in the dim ages. His plan of fortune was strange and yet successful. Few men would have thought of it. Fewer could have succeeded. For his estate was upon the western coast of that dark, mysterious continent, that baffler of explorers, Africa. There, by a small bay, had he cleared away the sullen jungle, built his castle and his storehouses, and with ruthless hand had he wrested the riches of the land. 4 ships he had, 3 smaller craft, and 1 great galleon. These plied between his domains and the cities of Spain, Portugal, France, and even England, laden with rare woods, ivory, slaves, the 1,000 strange riches that Dom Vincente had gained by trade and by conquest. Aye, a wild venture, a wilder commerce, and yet might he have shaped an empire from the dark land, had it not been for the rat-faced Carlos, his nephew. But I run ahead of my tale. Look, messieurs, I draw a map on the table, thus, with finger dipped in wine. Here lay the small, shallow harbor, and here the wide wharves. A landing ran thus, up the slight slope, with hut-like warehouses on each side, and here it stopped, at a wide, shallow moat. Over it went a narrow drawbridge, and then one was confronted with a high palisade of logs set in the ground. This extended entirely around the castle. The castle itself was built on the model of another earlier age, being more for strength than beauty, built of stone brought from a great distance. Years of labor and 1,000 Negroes toiling beneath the lash had reared its walls, and now completed, it offered an almost impregnable appearance. Such was the intention of its builders, for barbaric pirates ranged the coast, and the horror of a native uprising lurked ever near. A space of about a half-mile on every side of the castle was kept cleared away, and roads had been built through the marshy land. All this had required an immense amount of labor, but manpower was plentiful. A present to a chief, and he furnished all that was needed. And Portuguese know how to make men work. Less than 300 yards to the east of the castle ran a wide, shallow river which emptied into the harbor. The name has entirely slipped my mind. It was a heathenish title, and I could never lay my tongue to it. I found that I was not the only friend invited to the castle. It seems that once a year, or some such matter, Dom Vincente brought a host of jolly companions to his lonely estate, and made merry for some weeks to make up for the work and solitude of the rest of the year. In fact, it was nearly night, and a great banquet was in progress when I entered. I was acclaimed with great delight, greeted boisterously by friends, and introduced to such strangers as were there. Entirely too weary to take much part in the revelry, I ate, drank quietly, listened to the toast and songs, and studied the feasters. Dom Vincente, of course, I knew, as I had been intimate with him for years. Also, his pretty niece, Isabel, who was one reason I had accepted his invitation to come to that stinking wilderness. Her second cousin, Carlos, I knew and disliked. A sly, mincing fellow with a face like a minx. Then there was my old friend Luigi Verenza, an Italian, and his flirt of a sister, Morsita, making eyes at the men as usual. Then there was a short, stocky German who called himself Baron von Schiller, and Jean Desmort, and out at the elbows, noblemen of Gascony, and Don Florenzo di Seville, a lean, dark, silent man who called himself a Spaniard and wore a rapier nearly as long as himself. There were others, men and women, but it was long ago, and all their names and faces I do not remember. But there was one man whose face somehow drew my gaze as an alchemist magnet draws steel. He was a leanly built man of slightly more than medium height, dressed plainly, almost austerely, and he wore a sword almost as long as the Spaniards. But it was neither his clothes nor his sword which attracted my attention. It was his face, a refined, hybrid face. It was furrowed deep with lines that gave it a weary, haggard expression. Tiny scars flecked jaw and forehead as if torn by savage claws. I could have sworn the narrow, gray eyes had a fleeting, haunted look in their expression at times. I leaned over to that flirt, Morsita, and asked the name of the man, as it had slipped my mind that we had been introduced. De Montour, from Normandy, she answered. A strange man. I don't think I like him. Then he resist your snares, my little enchantress, I murmured, long friendship making me as immune from her anger as from her wiles. But she chose not to be angry and answered coyly, glancing from under demurely lowered lashes. I watched de Montour much, feeling somehow a strange fascination. He ate lightly, drank much, seldom spoke, then only to answer questions. Presently, toast making the rounds, I noticed his companions urging him to rise and give a health. At first, he refused, then rose upon their repeating urgings and stood silent for a moment, goblet raised. He seemed to dominate, to overawe the group of revelers. Then, with a mocking, savage laugh, he lifted the goblet above his head. "To Solomon," he exclaimed, "who bound all devils, and thrice cursed be he for that some escaped." A toast and a curse in one. It was drunk silently, and with many sidelong, doubting glances. That night, I retired early, weary of the long sea voyage, and my head spinning from the strength of the wine of which Dom Vincenti kept such great stores. My room was near the top of the castle and looked out toward the forest of the south and the river. The room was furnished in crude, barbaric splendor, as was all the rest of the castle. Going to the window, I gazed out at the arquebusier pacing the castle grounds just inside the palisade. at the cleared space lying unsightly and barren in the moonlight, at the forest beyond, at the silent river. From the native quarters close to the river bank came the weird twanging of some rude lute sounding a barbaric melody. In the dark shadows of the forest, some uncanny nightbird lifted a mocking voice. 1,000 minor notes sounded, birds and beast, and the devil knows what else. Some great jungle cat began a hair-lifting yowling. I shrugged my shoulders and turned from the windows. Surely devils lurked in those somber depths. There came a knock at my door, and I opened it to admit Demontor. He strode to the window and gazed at the moon, which rode resplendent and glorious. The moon is almost full, is it not, monsieur? He remarked, turning to me. I nodded, and I could have sworn that he shuddered. Your pardon, monsieur. I will not annoy you further. He turned to go, but at the door turned and retraced his steps. Monsieur, he almost whispered with a fierce intensity. Whatever you do, be sure yon bar and bolt your door tonight. Then he was gone, leaving me to stare after him bewilderedly. I dozed off to sleep, the distant shouts of the revelers in my ears, and though I was weary, or perhaps because of it, I slept lightly. While I never really awoke until morning, sounds and noises seemed to drift to me through my veil of slumber, and once it seemed that something was prying and shoving against the bolted door. As is to be supposed, most of the guests were in a beastly humor the following day and remained in their rooms most of the morning, or else straggled down late. Besides Don Vincenti, there were really only 3 of the masculine members sober: Demontor, the Spaniard de Seville, as he called himself, and myself. The Spaniard never touched wine, and though Demontor consumed incredible quantities of it, it never affected him in any way. The ladies greeted us most graciously. "So truth, senor," remarked that minx Marcita, giving me her hand with a gracious air that was like to make me snicker. "I am glad to see there are gentlemen among us who care more for our company than for the wine cup, for most of them are most surprisingly befuddled this morning." Then, with a most outrageous turning of her wondrous eyes, "Methinks someone was too drunk to be discreet last night, or not drunk enough. For unless my poor senses deceive me much, someone came fumbling at my door late in the night." "Ha!" I exclaimed in quick anger. "No, hush." She glanced about as if to see that we were alone. Then, "Is it not strange that Signor Demontor, before he retired last night, instructed me to fasten my door firmly?" "Strange," I murmured, but did not tell her that he had told me the same thing. "And is it not strange, Pierre, that though Signor Demontor left the banquet hall even before you did, yet he has the appearance of one Who has been up all night? I shrugged. A woman's fancies are often strange. Tonight, she said roguishly, I will leave my door unbolted and see whom I catch. You will do no such thing. She showed her little teeth in a contemptuous smile and displayed a small, wicked dagger. Listen, imp. Dementor gave me the same warning he did you. Whatever he knew, whoever prowled the halls last night, the object was more apt murder than amorous adventure. Keep your doors bolted. The Lady Isabel shares your room, does she not? Not she, and I send my woman to the slave quarters at night, she murmured, gazing mischievously at me from beneath drooping eyelids. One would think you a girl of no character from your talk, I told her, with the frankness of youth and of long friendship. Walk with care, young lady, else I tell your brother to spank you. And I walked away to pay my respects to Isabel. The Portuguese girl was the very opposite of Marcita, being a shy, modest young thing, not so beautiful as the Italian, but exquisitely pretty in an appealing, almost childish air. I once had thoughts, hi-ho, to be young and foolish. Your pardon, messieurs. An old man's mind wanders. It was of Dementor that I meant to tell you. Dementor and Don Vincente's mink-faced cousin. A band of armed natives were thronged about the gates, kept at a distance by the Portuguese soldiers. Among them were some score of young men and women, all naked, chained neck to neck. Slaves they were, captured by some warlike tribe and brought for sale. Dom Vincente looked them over personally. Followed a long haggling and bartering, of which I quickly wearied and turned away, wondering that a man of Dom Vincente's rank could so demean himself as to stoop to trade. But I strolled back when one of the natives of the village nearby came up and interrupted the sale with a long harangue to Dom Vincente. While they talked, Dementor came up, and presently Dom Vincente turned to us and said, one of the woodcutters of the village was torn to pieces by a leopard or some such beast last night. A strong, young man and unmarried. A leopard? Did they see it? Suddenly asked Dementor, and when Dom Vincente said no, that it came and went in the night, Dementor lifted a trembling hand and drew it across his forehead, as if to brush away cold sweat. Look, you, Pierre, quoth Dom Vincente. I have here a slave who, wonder of wonders, desires to be your man, though the devil only knows why. He led up a slim young jacquerie, a mere youth, whose main asset seemed a merry grin. He is yours, said Dom Vincente. He is goodly trained and will make a fine servant. And look ye, a slave is of an advantage over a servant, for all he requires is food and a loincloth, or so, with a touch of the whip to keep him in his place. It was not long before I learned why Gola wished to be my man, choosing me among all the rest. It was because of my hair. Like many dandies of that day, I wore it long and curled, the strands falling to my shoulders. As it happened, I was the only man of the party who so wore my hair, and Gola would sit and gaze at it in silent admiration for hours at a time, or until, growing nervous under his unblinking scrutiny, I would boot him forth. It was that night that a brooding animosity, hardly apparent, between Baron von Schiller and Jean Desmart broke out into a flame. As usual, woman was the cause. Rosita carried on a most outrageous flirtation with both of them. That was not wise. Desmart was a wild young fool. Von Schiller was a lustful beast. But when, messieurs, did woman ever use wisdom? Their hate flamed to a murderous fury when the Germans sought to kiss Rosita. Swords were clashing in an instant, but before Don Vincenti could thunder a command to halt, Luigi was between the combatants and had beaten their swords down, hurling them back viciously. "Signori," said he softly, but with a fierce intensity, "is it the part of hybrid signori to fight over my sister? Ha! By the toenails of Satan, for the toss of a coin, I would call you both out. You, Rosita, go to your chamber instantly, nor leave until I give you permission." And she went, for, independent though she was, none cared to face the slim, effeminate-appearing youth. When a tigerish snarl curled his lips, a murderous gleam lightened his dark eyes. Apologies were made, but from the glances the two rivals threw at each other, we knew that the quarrel was not forgotten and would blaze forth again at the slightest pretext. Late that night, I woke suddenly with a strange, eerie feeling of horror. Why, I could not say. I rose, saw that the door was firmly bolted, and seeing Gola asleep on the floor, kicked him awake irritably. And just as he got up, hastily rubbing himself, the silence was broken by a wild scream, a scream that rang through the castle and brought a startled shout from the arquebusier basing the palisade. A scream from the mouth of a girl frenzied with terror. Gola squawked and dived behind the divan. I jerked the door open and raced down the dark corridor. Dashing down a winding stair, I caroomed into someone at the bottom, and we tumbled headlong. He gasped something, and I recognized the voice of Jean Desmart. I hauled him to his feet and raced along, he following. The screams had ceased, but the whole castle was in an uproar, voices shouting, the clink of weapons, lights flashing up, Don Vincente's voice shouting for the soldiers, the noise of armed men rushing through the rooms and falling over each other. With all the confusion, Desmart, the Spaniard, and I reached Rosita's room just as Luigi darted inside and snatched his sister into his arms. Others rushed in, carrying lights and weapons, shouting, demanding to know what was occurring. The girl lay quietly in her brother's arms, her dark hair loose and rippling over her shoulders, her dainty night garments torn to shreds and exposing her lovely body, Long scratches showed up her arms, breast, and shoulders. Presently, she opened her eyes, shuddered, then shrieked wildly and clung frantically to Luigi, begging him not to let something take her. "The door," she whimpered. "I left it unbarred, and something crept into my room through the darkness. I struck at it with my dagger, and it hurled me to the floor, tearing at me. Then I fainted." "Where is Von Schiller?" asked the Spaniard, a fierce glint in his dark eyes. Every man glanced at his neighbor. All the guests were there except the German. I noted de Montour gazing at the terrified girl, his face more haggard than usual, and I thought it strange that he wore no weapon. "Aye, Von Schiller!" exclaimed Desmond fiercely, and half of us followed Don Vincente out into the corridor. We began a vengeful search through the castle, and in a small dark hallway, we found Von Schiller. On his face he lay, in a crimson, ever-widening stain. "This is the work of some native," exclaimed Desmond, face aghast. "Nonsense," bellowed Don Vincente. "No native from the outside could pass the soldiers. All slaves, Von Schillers among them, were barred and bolted in the slave quarters, except Gola, who sleeps in Pierre's room, and Isabel's woman." "But who else could have done this deed?" exclaimed Desmond in a fury. "You," I said abruptly, "else why ran you so swiftly away from the room of Morsita?" "Curse you, you lie!" he shouted, and his swift-drawn sword leaped for my breast. But quick as he was, the Spaniard was quicker. Desmond's rapier clattered against the wall, and Desmond stood like a statue, the Spaniard's motionless point just touching his throat. "Bind him," said the Spaniard without passion. "Put down your blade, Don Florenzo," commanded Don Vincente, striding forward and dominating the scene. "Senor Desmond, you are one of my best friends, but I am the only law here, and duty must be done. Give your word that you will not seek to escape." "I give it," replied the Gascon calmly. "I acted hastily. I apologize. I was not intentionally running away, but the halls and corridors of this cursed castle confused me. Of us all, probably but one man believed him." "Messieurs," de Montour stepped forward. "This youth is not guilty. Turn the German over." Two soldiers did as he asked. De Montour shuddered, pointing. The rest of us glanced once, then recoiled in horror. "Good man have done that thing." "With a dagger?" began someone. "No dagger makes wounds like that," said the Spaniard. "The German was torn to pieces by the talons of some frightful beast." We glanced about us, half expecting some hideous monster to leap upon us from the shadows. We searched that castle, every foot, every inch of it, and we found no trace of any beast. Dawn was breaking when I returned to my room to find that Gola had barred himself in, and it took me nearly a half hour to convince him to let me in. Having smacked him soundly and berated him for his cowardice. I told him what had taken place, as he could understand French and could speak a weird mixture, which he proudly called French. His mouth gaped, and only the whites of his eyes showed as the tale reached its climax.
Juju,
he whispered fearsomely.
Perish man.
Suddenly, an idea came to me. I had heard vague tales, little more than hints of legends, of the devilish leopard cult that existed on the West Coast. No white man had ever seen one of its votaries, but Dom Vincente had told us tales of beast men, disguised in skins of leopards, who stole through the midnight jungle and slew and devoured. A ghastly thrill traveled up and down my spine, and in an instant I had Gola in a grasp which made him yell. "Was that a leopard man?" I hissed, shaking him viciously.
Massa,
he gasped.
me good boy. Juju man git. Mo bessa no tell.
"You'll tell me," I gritted, renewing my endeavors until his hands, waving feeble protest, he promised to tell me what he knew.
No leopard man,
he whispered, and his eyes grew big with supernatural fear.
Moon, he full. Woodcutter find. Him heap clawed. Find another woodcutter. Big massa. Dom Vincente. Say leopard. No leopard. But leopard man, he come to kill. Something kill leopard man. Heap claw. Hi. Moon full again. Something come in lonely hut. Claw woman. Claw Pikmin. Man. Find claw up. Big massa say leopard. Full moon again. And woodcutter find heap clawed. Now come in castle. No leopard. But always footmarks of a man. I gave a startled, incredulous exclamation. It was true, Gola averred. Always the footprints of a man led away from the scene of the murder. Then why did the natives not tell the big massa that he might hunt down the fiend? Here Gola assumed a crafty expression and whispered in my ear. The footprints were of a man who wore shoes. Even assuming that Gola was lying, I felt the thrill of unexplainable horror. Who then did the natives believe was doing these frightful murders? And he answered, Dom Vincente. By this time, messieurs, my mind was in a whirl. What was the meaning of all this? Who slew the German and sought to ravish Mosita? And as I reviewed the crime, it appeared to me that murder rather than rape was the object of the attack. Why did Timator warn us and then appear to have knowledge of the crime, telling us that Desmart was innocent and then proving it? It was all beyond me. The tale of the slaughter got among the natives in spite of all we could do, and they appeared restless and nervous. And thrice that day Dom Vincente had a black lashed for insolence. A brooding atmosphere pervaded the castle. I considered going to Dom Vincente with Gola's tale, but decided to wait a while. The women kept their chambers that day. The men were restless and moody. Dom Vincente announced that the sentries would be doubled and some would
patrol the corridors of the castle itself, I found myself musing cynically that if Gola's suspicions were true, sentries would be of little good. I am not, messieurs, a man to brook such a situation with patience, and I was young then, so as we drank before retiring, I flung my goblet on the table and angrily announced that in spite of man, beast, or devil, I slept that night with doors flung wide, and I tramped angrily to my chamber. Again, as on the first night, Demontor came, and his face was as a man who has looked into the gaping gates of hell. "I have come," he said, "to ask you, nay, monsieur, to implore you to reconsider your rash determination." I shook my head impatiently. "You are resolved, yes? Then I ask you to do this for me, that after I enter my chamber, you will bolt my doors from the outside." I did as he asked, and then made my way back to my chamber, my mind in a maze of wonderment. I had sent Gola to the slave quarters, and I laid rapier and dagger close at hand. Nor did I go to bed, but crouched in a great chair in the darkness. Then I had much ado to keep from sleeping. To keep myself awake, I fell to musing on the strange words of Demontor. He seemed to be laboring under great excitement. His eyes hinted of ghastly mysteries known to him alone, and yet his face was not that of a wicked man. Suddenly, the notion took me to go to his chamber and talk with him. Walking those dark passages was a shuddersome task, but eventually I stood before Demontor's door. I called softly. Silence. I reached out a hand and felt splintered fragments of wood. Hastily I struck flint and steel, which I carried, and the flaming tinder showed the great oaken door sagging on its mighty hinges. Showed a door smashed and splintered from the inside. And the chamber of Demontor was unoccupied. Some instinct prompted me to hurry back to my room swiftly but silently, shoeless feet treading softly. And as I neared the door, I was aware of something in the darkness before me. Something which crept in from a side corridor and glided stealthily along. In a wild panic of fear, I leaped, striking wildly and aimlessly in the darkness. My clenched fist encountered a human head, and something went down with a crash. Again, I struck a light. A man lay senseless on the floor, and he was Demontor. I thrust a candle into a niche in the wall, and just then Demontor's eyes opened, and he rose uncertainly. "You!" I exclaimed, hardly knowing what I said. "You of all men!" He merely nodded. "You killed Von Schiller?"
Yes.
I recoiled with a gasp of horror. "Listen." He raised his hand. "Take your rapier and run me through. No man will touch you." "No," I exclaimed. "I cannot." "Then quick," he said hurriedly. "Get into your chamber and bolt the door. Haste! It will return." "What will return?" I asked with a thrill of horror. "If it will harm me, it will harm you," come into the chamber with me."
No, no!
He fairly shrieked, springing back from my outstretched arm.
Haste, haste! It left me for an instant, but it will return.
Then, in a low-pitched voice of indescribable horror,
It is returning. It is here now.
and I felt a something, a formless, shapeless presence near, a thing of frightfulness. The mentor was standing, legs braced, arms thrown back, fists clenched. The muscles bulged beneath his skin. His eyes widened and narrowed. The veins stood out upon his forehead as if in great physical effort. As I looked, to my horror, out of nothing, a shapeless, nameless something took vague form. Like a shadow, it moved upon the mentor. It was hovering about him. Good God! It was merging, becoming one with the man. The mentor swayed. A great gasp escaped him. The dim thing vanished. The mentor wavered. Then he turned toward me. And may God grant that I never look on a face like that again. It was a hideous, a bestial face. The eyes gleamed with a frightful ferocity. The snarling lips were drawn back from gleaming teeth, which to my startled gaze appeared more like bestial fangs than human teeth. Silently, the thing, I cannot call it a human, slunk toward me. Gasping with horror, I sprang back and through the door, just as the thing launched itself through the air with a sinuous motion, which even then made me think of a leaping wolf. I slammed the door, holding it against the frightful thing, which hurled itself again and again against it. Finally, it desisted, and I heard it slink stealthily off down the corridor. Faint and exhausted, I sat down, waiting, listening. Through the open window wafted the breeze, bearing all the scents of Africa, the spicy and the foul. From the native village came the sound of a native drum. Other drums answered farther up the river and back in the bush. Then, from somewhere in the jungle, hardly incongruous, sounded the long, high-pitched call of a timber wolf. My soul revolted. Dawn brought a tale of terrified villagers, of a Negro woman torn by some fiend of the night, barely escaping. And to the mentor I went. On the way I met Dom Vincente. He was perplexed and angry.
Some hellish thing is at work in this castle,
he said.
Last night, though I have said naught of it to anyone, something leaped upon the back of one of the arquebusiers, tore the leather jerkin from his shoulders, and pursued him to the barbican. More, someone locked the mentor into his room last night, and he was forced to smash the door to get out. He strode on, muttering to himself, and I proceeded down the stairs, more puzzled than ever. The mentor sat upon a stool, gazing out the window. An indescribable air of weariness was about him. His long hair was uncombed and tousled. His garments were tattered. With a shudder, I saw faint
crimson stains upon his hands, and noted that the nails were torn and broken. He looked up as I came in and waved me to a seat. His face was worn and haggard, but was that of a man. After a moment's silence, he spoke. I will tell you my strange tale. Never before has it passed my lips. And why I tell you, knowing that you will not believe me, I cannot say. And then I listened to what was surely the wildest, the most fantastic, the weirdest tale ever heard by man. Years ago, said Demontor, I was upon a military mission in northern France. Alone, I was forced to pass through the fiend-haunted woodlands of Villefere. In those frightful forests, I was beset by an inhuman, a ghastly thing, a werewolf. Beneath a midnight moon, we fought, and I slew it. Now this is the truth, that if a werewolf is slain in the half form of a man, its ghost will haunt its slayer through eternity. But if it is slain as a wolf, hell gapes to receive it. The true werewolf is not, as many think, a man who may take the form of a wolf, but a wolf who takes the form of a man. Now listen, my friend, and I will tell you of the wisdom, the hellish knowledge that is mine, gained through many a frightful deed imparted to me amid the ghastly shadows of midnight forest, where fiends and half-beasts roamed. In the beginning, the world was strange, misshapen. Grotesque beasts wandered through its jungles, driven from another world. Ancient demons and fiends came in great numbers and settled upon this newer, younger world. Long the forces of good and evil warred. A strange beast, known as man, wandered among the other beasts, and since good or bad must have a concrete form ere either accomplishes its desire, the spirits of good entered man. The fiends entered other beasts, reptiles, and birds, and long and fiercely waged the age-old battle. But man conquered. The great dragons and serpents were slain, and with them the demons. Finally, Solomon, wise beyond the kin of man, made great war upon them, and by virtue of his wisdom slew, seized, and bound. But there were some which were the fiercest, the boldest, and though Solomon drove them out, he could not conquer them. Those had taken the form of wolves. As the ages passed, wolf and demon became merged. No longer could the fiend leave the body of the wolf at will. In many instances, the savagery of the wolf overcame the subtlety of the demon and enslaved him, so the wolf became again only a beast, a fierce, cunning beast, but merely a beast. But of the werewolves, there are many, even yet. And during the time of the full moon, the wolf may take the form, or the half form, of a man. when the moon hovers at her zenith. However, the wolf spirit again takes ascendancy, and the werewolf becomes a true wolf once more. But if it is slain in the form of a man, then the spirit is free to haunt its slayer through the ages. Hearken now, I had thought to have slain the thing after it had changed to its true shape, but I slew it an instant too soon. The moon, though it approached the zenith, had not yet reached it, nor had the thing taken on fully the wolf form. Of this I knew nothing and went my way. But when the next time approached for the full moon, I began to be aware of a strange, malicious influence. An atmosphere of horror hovered in the air, and I was aware of inexplicable, uncanny impulses. One night, in a small village in the center of a great forest, the influence came upon me with full power. It was night, and the moon, nearly full, was rising over the forest. And between the moon and me, I saw, floating in the upper air, ghostly and barely discernible, the outline of a wolf's head. I remember little of what happened thereafter. I remember dimly clambering into the silent street. Remember struggling, resisting briefly, vainly, and the rest is a crimson maze until I came to myself the next morning and found my garments and hands caked and stained crimson, and heard the horrified chattering of the villagers telling of a pair of clandestine lovers slaughtered in a ghastly manner, scarcely outside the village, torn to pieces as if by wild beasts, as if by wolves. From that village I fled aghast, but I fled not alone. In the day, I could not feel the drive of my fearful captor, but when night fell and the moon rose, I ranged the silent forest, a frightful thing, a slayer of humans, a fiend in a man's body. God, the battles I have fought, but always it overcame me and drove me ravening after some new victim. But after the moon had passed its fullness, the thing's power over me ceased suddenly, nor did it return until 3 nights before the moon was full again. Since then, I have roamed the world, fleeing, seeking to escape. Always the thing follows, taking possession of my body when the moon is full. Gods, the frightful deeds I have done! I would have slain myself long ago, but I dare not. For the soul of a suicide is accursed, and my soul would be forever hunted through the flames of hell. And hearken, most frightful of all, my slain body would forever roam the earth, moved and inhabited by the soul of the werewolf. Can any thought be more ghastly? And I seem immune to the weapons of man. Swords have pierced me, daggers have hacked me. I am covered with scars, yet never have they struck me down. In Germany, they bound and led me to the block. there would I have willingly placed my head. But the thing came upon me, and breaking my bonds, I slew and fled. Up and down the world I have wandered, leaving horror and slaughter in my trail. Chains, cells cannot hold me. The thing is fastened to me through all eternity. In desperation, I accepted Don Vincente's invitation. For look you, none knows of my frightful double life, since no one could recognize me in the clutch of the demon, and few, seeing me, live to tell of it. My hands all red, my soul doomed to everlasting flames. My mind is torn with remorse for my crimes, and yet I can do nothing to help myself. Surely, yeah, no man ever knew the hell that I have known. Yes, I slew Von Schiller, and I sought to destroy the girl, Rosita. Why I did not, I cannot say, for I have slain both women and men. Now, if you will, take your sword and slay me, and with my last breath, I will give you the good God's blessing. No? You know now my tale, and you see before you a man, fiend haunted for all eternity. My mind was spinning with wonderment as I left the room of Dimator. What to do, I knew not. It seemed likely that he would yet murder us all, and yet I could not bring myself to tell Dom Vincente all. From the bottom of my soul, I pitied Dimator. So I kept my peace, and in the days that followed, I made occasion to seek him out and converse with him. A real friendship sprang up between us. About this time, that black devil, Gola, began to wear an air of suppressed excitement, as if he knew something he wished desperately to tell, but would not, or else dared not. So the days passed in feasting, drinking, and hunting, until one night Dimator came to my chamber and pointed silently at the moon, which was just rising. Look ye, he said, I have a plan. I will give it out that I am going into the jungle for hunting and will go forth, apparently for several days. But at night I will return to the castle, and you must lock me into the dungeon which is used as a storeroom. This we did, and I managed to slip down twice a day and carry food and drink to my friend. He insisted on remaining in the dungeon, even in the day, for though the fiend had never exerted its influence over him in the daytime, and he believed it powerless then, yet he would take no chances. It was during this time that I began to notice that Dom Vincente's meat-faced cousin, Carlos, was forcing his attentions upon Isabel, who was his second cousin, and who seemed to resent those attentions. Myself, I would have challenged him for a duel, for the toss of a coin, for I despised him, but it was really none of my affair. However, it seemed that Isabel feared him. My friend Luigi, by the way, had become enamored of the dainty Portuguese girl and was making swift love to her daily. And Dimator sat in his cell and reviewed his ghastly deeds until he battered the bars with his bare hands. And Don Florenzo wandered about the castle grounds like a dour Mephistopheles. And the other guests rode and quarreled and drank. And Gola slithered about, eyeing me if always on the point of imparting momentous information. What wonder if my nerves became rasped to the shrieking point. Each day the natives grew surlier and more sullen and intractable. One night, not long before the full of the moon, I entered the dungeon where Dimator sat. He looked up quickly. "You dare much coming to me in the night." I shrugged my shoulders, seating myself. A small barred window let in the night scents and sounds of Africa. "Hark to the native drums," I said. "For the past week, they have sounded almost incessantly." Dimator assented. "The natives are restless. Methinks 'tis deviltry they are planning. Have you noticed that Carlos is much among them?" "No," I answered, "but 'tis like there will be a break between him and Luigi. Luigi is paying court to Isabel." So we talked, when suddenly Dimator became silent and moody, answering only in monosyllables. The moon rose and peered in at the barred windows. Dimator's face was illuminated by its beams. And then the hand of horror grasped me. On the wall behind Dimator appeared a shadow clearly defined of a wolf's head. At the same instant, Dimator felt its influence. With a shriek, he bounded from his stool. He pointed fiercely, and as with trembling hands I slammed and bolted the door behind me, I felt him hurl his weight against it. As I fled up the stairway, I heard a wild raving and battering at the iron-bound door. But with all the werewolf's might, the great door held. As I entered my room, Gola dashed in and gasped out the tale he had been keeping for days. I listened incredulously and then dashed forth to find Dom Vincente. I was told that Carlos had asked him to accompany him to the village to arrange a sale of slaves. My informer was Don Florenzo of Seville, and when I gave him a brief outline of Gola's tale, he accompanied me. Together, we dashed through the castle gate, flinging a word to the guards and down the landing toward the village. "Dom Vincente! Dom Vincente! Walk with care! Keep sword loosened in its sheath! Fool! Fool! To walk in the night with Carlos, the traitor!" They were nearing the village when we caught up with them. "Don Vicente!" I exclaimed. "Return instantly to the castle. Carlos is selling you into the hands of the natives. Gola has told me that he lusts for your wealth and for Isabel." A terrified native babbled to him of booted footprints near the places where the woodcutters were murdered, and Carlos has made the blacks believe that the slayer was you. Tonight the natives were to rise and slay every man in the castle, except Carlos. Do you not believe me, Dom Vincente?" "Is this truth, Carlos?" asked Dom Vincente in amaze. Carlos laughed mockingly. "Ha ha! The fool speaks truth," he said. "But it accomplishes you nothing. Ho!" he shouted as he leaped for Dom Vincente. Steel flashed in the moonlight, and the Spaniard's sword was through Carlos ere he could move, and the shadows rose about us. Then it was back to back, sword and dagger. 3 men against 100. Spears flashed, and a fiendish yell went up from savage throats. I spitted 3 natives in as many thrusts, and then went down from a stunning swing from a war club. And an instant later, Dom Vincenti fell upon me with a spear in one arm and another through the leg. Don Florenzo was standing above us, sword leaping like a living thing, when a charge of the arquebusiers swept the riverbank clear, and we were borne into the castle. The black hordes came with a rush, spears flashing like a wave of steel, a thunderous roar of savagery going up to the skies. Time and again they swept up the slopes, bounding the moat until they were swarming over the palisades, and time and again the fire of the 100-odd defenders hurled them back. They had set fire to the plundered warehouses, and their light vied with the light of the moon. Just across the river, there was a larger storehouse, and about this hordes of the natives gathered, tearing it apart for plunder.
Would that they would drop torch upon it,
said Dom Vincente.
or not is stored therein, save some 1,000 pounds of gunpowder. I dared not store the treacherous stuff beside the river. All the tribes of the river and coast have gathered for our slaughter, and all my ships are upon the seas. We may hold out a while, but eventually they will swarm the palisade and put us to the slaughter.
I hastened to the dungeon wherein Dimator sat. Outside the door, I called to him, and he bade me enter in voice, which told me the fiend had left him for an instant. The blacks had risen, I told him.
I guessed as much. How does the battle?
I gave him the details of the betrayal and the fight, and mentioned the powder house across the river. He sprang to his feet.
Now, by my hag-ridden soul,
he exclaimed,
I will fling the dice once more with hell. Swift, let me out of the castle. I will essay to swim the river and set off yon powder.
It is insanity, I exclaimed. 1,000 blacks lurk between the palisades and the river, and thrice that number beyond. The river itself swarms with crocodiles.
I will attempt it,
he answered, a great light in his face.
If I can reach it, some 1,000 natives will lighten the siege. If I am slain, then my soul is free, and mayhap will gain some forgiveness, for that I gave my life to atone for my crimes.
Then,
haste,
he exclaimed,
for the demon is returning. Already I feel his influence. Haste ye!
For the castle gates we sped, and as Dimator ran, he gasped, as a man in a terrific battle. At the gate he pitched headlong, then rose to spring through it. Wild yells greeted him from the natives. The arquebusiers shouted curses at him and at me. Peering down from the top of the palisades, I saw him turn from side to side uncertainly. A score of natives were rushing recklessly forward, spears raised. Then the eerie wolf yell rose to the skies, and Dimator bounded forward. Aghast, the natives paused, and before a man of them could move, he was among them. Wild shrieks, not of rage, but of terror. In amazement, the arquebusiers held their fire. Straight through the group of blacks, Dementor charged. And when they broke and fled, 3 of them fled not. A dozen steps Dementor took in pursuit, then stopped, stock still. A moment he stood so, while spears flew about him, then turned and ran swiftly in the direction of the river. A few steps from the river, another band of blacks barred his way. In the flaming light of the burning houses, the scene was clearly illuminated. A thrown spear tore through Dementor's shoulder. Without pausing in his stride, he tore it forth and drove it through a native, leaping over his body to get among the others. They could not face the fiend-driven white man. With shrieks, they fled, and Dementor, bounding upon the back of one, brought him down. Then he rose, staggered, and sprang to the riverbank. An instant he paused there, and then vanished in the shadows. "Name of the devil!" gasped Dom Vincente at my shoulder. "What manner of man is that? Was that Dementor?" I nodded. The wild yells of the natives rose above the crackle of the arquebus fire. They were massed thick about the great warehouse across the river. "They plan a great rush," said Dom Vincente. "They will swarm clear over the palisade, methinks. Ha!" A crash that seemed to rip the skies apart. A burst of flame that mounted to the stars. The castle rocked with the explosion, then silence, as the smoke drifting away showed only a greater crater where the warehouse had stood. I could tell of how Dom Vincente led a charge, crippled as he was, out of the castle gate and down the slope to fall upon the terrified blacks who had escaped the explosion. I could tell of the slaughter, of the victory and the pursuit of the fleeing natives. I could tell too, messieurs, of how I became separated from the band and of how I wandered far into the jungle, unable to find my way back to the coast. I could tell how I was captured by a wandering band of slave raiders and of how I escaped. But such is not my intention. In itself, it would make a long tale. And it is of Dementor that I am speaking. I thought much of the things that had passed and wondered if indeed Dementor reached the storehouse to blow it to the skies, or whether it was but the deed of chance. That a man could swim that reptile-swarming river, fiend-driven though he was, seemed impossible. And if he blew up the storehouse, he must have gone up with it. So one night I pushed my way wearily through the jungle and sighted the coast, and close to the shore a small, tumble-down hut of thatch. To it I went, thinking to sleep therein if insects and reptiles would allow. I entered the doorway and then stopped short. Upon a makeshift stool sat a man. He looked up as I entered, and the rays of the moon fell across his face. I started back with a ghastly thrill of horror. It was Dementor, and the moon was full. Then as I stood, unable to flee, he rose and came toward me, and his face, though haggard as of a man who has looked into hell, was the face of a sane man. "Come in, my friend," he said, and there was a great peace in his voice. "Come in and fear me not. The fiend has left me forever." "But tell me, how conquered you?" I exclaimed as I grasped his hand.
"I fought a frightful battle as I ran to the river," he answered, "for the fiend had me in its grasp and drove me to fall upon the natives. But for the first time my soul and mind gained ascendancy. For an instant just long enough to hold me to my purpose, and I believe the good saints came to my aid, for I was giving my life to save life. I leaped into the river and swam, and in an instant the crocodiles were swarming about me. Again, in the clutch of the fiend, I fought them there in the river. Then suddenly the thing left me. I climbed from the river and fired the warehouse. The explosion hurled me hundreds of feet, and for days I wandered witless through the jungle. But the full moon came and came again, and I felt not the influence of the fiend. I am free, free!" And a wondrous note of exultation, nay, exaltation, thrilled his words. "My soul is free. Incredible as it seems, the demon lies drowned upon the bed of the river, or else inhabits the body of one of the savage reptiles that swim the ways of the Niger." The Phantom Farmhouse by Seabury Quinn. Here's a story of creeping horror that rises gradually to a powerful climax. It's a story not easily forgotten. I had been at the New Briarcliff Sanitarium nearly 3 weeks before I actually saw the house. Every morning, as I lay abed after the nurse had taken my temperature, I wondered what was beyond the copse of fir and spruce at the turn of the road. The picture seemed incomplete, without chimneys rising among the evergreens. I thought about it so much, I finally convinced myself there really was a house in the wood. A house where people lived and worked and were happy. All during the long, trying days when I was learning to navigate a wheelchair, I used to picture the house and the people who lived in it. There would be a father, I was sure, a stout, good-natured father, somewhat bald, who sat on the porch and smoked a cob pipe in the evening. And there was a mother, too, a waistless, plaid-skirted mother with hair smoothly parted over her forehead, who sat beside the father as he rocked and smoked, and who had a brown work basket in her lap. She spread the stocking feet over her outstretched fingers, and her vigilant needle spied out and closed every hole with a cunning no mechanical loom could rival. Then there was a daughter. I was a little hazy in my conception of her, but I knew she was tall and slender as a hazel wand, and that her eyes were blue and wide and sympathetic. Picturing the house and its people became a favorite pastime with me during the time I was acquiring the art of walking all over again. By the time I was able to trust my legs on the road, I felt I knew my way to my vision friend's home, as well as I knew the byways of my own parish. Though I had as yet not set foot outside the sanitarium. Oddly enough, I chose the evening for my first long stroll. It was unusually warm for September in Maine, and some of the sturdier of the convalescents had been playing tennis during the afternoon. After dinner, they sat on the veranda, comparing notes on their respective cases of influenza or matching experiences in appendicitis operations. After building the house bit by bit from my imagination, as a child pieces together a picture puzzle, I should have been bitterly disappointed if the woods had proved empty. Yet, when I reached the turn of the road and found my dream house a reality, I was almost afraid. Bit for bit and part for part, it was as I had visualized it. A long, rambling, comfortable-looking farmhouse it was, with a wide porch screened by vines and a whitewashed picket fence about the little clearing before it. There was a tumble-down gate in the fence, one of the kind that is held shut with a weighted chain. Looking closely, I saw the weight was a disused plowshare. Leading from gate to porch was a path of flat stones laid unevenly in the short grass and bordered with a double row of clamshells. A lamp burned in the front room, sending out cheerful golden rays to meet the silver moonlight. A strange, eerie sensation came over me as I stood there. Somehow, I felt I had seen that house before. Many, many times before. Yet, I had never been in that part of Maine till I came to Briarcliff, nor had anyone ever described the place to me. Indeed, except for my idle dreams, I had no intimation that there was a house in those pines at all. Who lives in the house at the turn of the road? I asked the fat man who roomed next to me. He looked at me as blankly as if I had addressed him in Choctaw, then countered, "What road?" "Why, the South Road," I explained. "I mean the house in the pines, just beyond the curve, you know." If such a thing had not been obviously absurd, I should have thought he looked frightened at my answer. Certainly, his already prominent eyes started a bit further from his face. "Nobody lives there," he assured me. "Nobody's lived there for years. There isn't any house there." I became angry. What right had this fella to make my civil question the occasion for an ill-timed jest? "As you please," I replied. "Perhaps there isn't any house there for you, but I saw one there last night." "My God!" he ejaculated and hurried away as if I'd just told him I was infected with smallpox. Later in the day, I overheard a snatch of conversation between him and one of his acquaintances in the lounge. "I tell you, it's so," he was saying with great earnestness. "I thought it was all a lot of poppycock myself, but that clergyman saw it last night. I'm going to pack my traps and get back to the city and not waste any time about it either." "Rats," his companion scoffed. "He must have been stringing you." Turning to light a cigar, he caught sight of me. "Say, Mr. Weatherby," he called, "you didn't mean to tell my friend here that you really saw a house down by those pines last night, did you?" "I certainly did," I answered. "And I tell you, too, there's nothing unusual about it, is there?" "Is there?" he repeated. "Is there? Say, what did it look like?" I described it to him as well as I could, and his eyes grew as wide as those of a child hearing the story of Bluebeard.
Well, I'll be a Chinaman's uncle, he declared as I finished. I sure will.
See here, I demanded. What's all the mystery about that farmhouse? Why shouldn't I see it? It's there to be seen, isn't it? He gulped once or twice, as if there were something hot in his mouth, before he answered.
Look here, Mr. Weatherby. I'm telling you this for your own good. You'd better stay in o' nights, and you'd better stay away from those pines in particular.
Nonplussed at this unsolicited advice, I was about to ask an explanation when I detected the aftertang of whiskey on his breath. I understood then. I was being made the butt of a drunken joke by a pair of racecourse followers. I'm very much obliged, I'm sure, I replied with dignity. But if you don't mind, I'll choose my own comings and goings.
Oh, go as far as you like.
He waved his arms wide in token of my complete free agency.
Go as far as you like. I'm going to New York.
And he did. The pair of them left the sanitarium that afternoon. A slight recurrence of my illness held me housebound for several days after my conversation with the two sportively inclined gentlemen, and the next time I ventured out at night, the moon had waxed to the full, pouring a flood of light upon the earth that rivaled midday. The minutest objects were as readily distinguished as they would have been before sunset. In fact, I remember comparing the evening to a silver-plated noon. As I trudged along the road to the pine copse, I was busy formulating plans for intruding into the family circle at the farmhouse, devising all manner of pious frauds by which to scrape acquaintance. Shall I feign having lost my way and inquire direction to the sanitarium? Or shall I ask if some mythical acquaintance, a John Squires, for instance, lives there? I asked myself as I neared the turn of the road. Fortunately for my conscience, all these subterfuges were unnecessary, for as I neared the whitewashed fence, a girl left the porch and walked quickly to the gate, where she stood gazing pensively along the moonlit road. It was almost as if she were coming to meet me, I thought, as I slackened my pace and assumed an air of deliberate casualness. Almost abreast of her, I lowered my cadence still more and looked directly at her. Then I knew why my conception of the girl who lived in that house had been misty and indistinct. For the same reason the venerable John had faltered in his description of the New Jerusalem until his vision in the Isle of Patmos. From the smoothly parted hair above her wide forget-me-not eyes to the hem of her white cotton frock, she was as slender and lovely as a Rossetti saint, as wonderful to the eye as a medieval poet's vision of his lost love in paradise. Her forehead, evenly framed in the beaten bronze of her hair, was wide and high, and startlingly white, and her brows were delicately penciled, as if laid on by an artist with a camel's hair brush. The eyes themselves were sweet and clear as forest pools, mirroring the September sky, and lifted a little at the corners, like an oriental's, giving her face a quaint, exotic look in the midst of these Maine woods. So slender was her figure that the swell of her bosom was barely perceptible under the light stuff of her dress, and as she stood immobile in the nimbus of moon rays, the undulation of the line from her shoulders to ankles was what painters call a curve of motion. One hand rested lightly on the gate, finely cut as a bit of Italian sculpture and scarcely less white than the limed wood supporting it. I noticed idly that the forefinger was somewhat longer than its fellows, and that the nails were almond-shaped and very pink, almost red, as if they had been rouged and brightly polished. No man can take stock of a woman thus, even in a cursory, fleeting glimpse, without her being aware of the inspection, and in the minute my eyes drank up her beauty, our glances crossed and held. The look she gave back was as calm and unperturbed as though I had been non-existent. One might have thought I was an invisible wraith of the night, yet the faint suspicion of a flush quickening in her throat and cheeks told me she was neither unaware nor unappreciative of my scrutiny. Mechanically, I raised my cap, and, wholly without conscious volition, I heard my own voice asking, "May I trouble you for a drink from your well? I'm from the sanitarium, only a few days out of bed, in fact, and I fear I've overdone myself in my walk." A smile flitted across her rather wide lips, quick and sympathetic as a mother's response to her child's request, as she swung the gate open for me. "Surely," she answered, and her voice had all the sweetness of the south wind soughing through her native pines. "Surely you may drink at our well, and rest yourself too, if you wish." She preceded me up the path, quickening her pace as she neared the house, and running nimbly up the steps to the porch. From where I stood beside the old-fashioned well, fitted with windlass and bucket, I could hear the sound of whispering voices in earnest conversation. Hers I recognized, lowered though it was, by the flute-like purling of its tones. The other two were deeper, and, it seemed to me, hoarse and throaty. Somehow, odd as it seemed, there was a queer canine note in them, dimly reminding me of the muttering of not too friendly dogs. Such fractious growls I had heard while doing missionary duty in Alaska, when the savage half-wolf malamutes were not fed promptly at the relay stations. Her voice rose a thought higher, as if in argument, and I fancied I heard her whisper, "This one is mine, I tell you. Mine. I'll brook no interference. Go to your own hunting." An instant more, there was a reluctant, assenting growl from the shadow of the vines curtaining the porch, and a light laugh from the girl as she descended the steps, swinging a bright tin cup in her hand. For a second, she looked at me as she sent the bucket plunging into the stone-curbed well. Then she announced, in explanation, "We're great hunters here, you know. The season is just in, and Dad and I have the worst quarrels about whose game is whose." She laughed, in recollection of their argument, and I laughed with her. I had been quite a Nimrod as a boy myself, and well I remembered the heated controversies as to whose charge of shot was responsible for some luckless bunny's demise. The well was very deep, and my breath was coming fast by the time I had helped her wind the bucket rope upon the windlass. But the water was cold as only spring-fed well water can be. As she poured it from the bucket, it shone almost like foam in the moonlight, and seemed to whisper
with a half-human voice instead of gurgling as other water does when poured. I had drunk water in nearly every quarter of the globe, but never such water as that. Cold as the breath from a glacier, limpid as visualized air. It was yet so light and tasteless in substance that only the chill in my throat and the sight of the liquid in the cup told me that I was doing more than going through the motions of drinking. "And now, will you rest?" she invited as I finished my third draught. "We've an extra chair on the porch for you." Behind the screen of vines, I found her father and mother seated in the rays of the big kitchen lamp. They were just as I had expected to find them, plain, homely, sincere country folk, courteous in their reception and anxious to make a sick stranger welcome. Both were stout, with the comfortable stoutness of middle age and good health, but both had surprisingly slender hands. I noticed, too, that the same characteristic of an overlong forefinger was apparent in their hands as in their daughters, and that both their nails were trimmed to points and stained almost a brilliant red. "My father, Mr. Squires," the girl introduced, "and my mother, Mrs. Squires." I could not repress a start. These people bore the very name I had casually thought to use when inquiring for some imaginary person. My lucky stars had surely guided me away from that attempt to scrape an acquaintance. What a figure I should have cut if I had actually asked for Mr. Squires. Though I was not aware of it, my curious glance must have stayed longer on their red nails than I had intended, for Mrs. Squires looked deprecatingly at her hands. "We've all been turning in, putting up fox grapes." She included her husband and daughter with a comprehensive gesture. "And the stain just won't wash out. Has to wear off, you know." I spent perhaps 2 hours with my newfound friends, talking of everything from the best methods of potato culture to the surest way of landing a 9-pound bass. All three joined in the conversation and took a lively interest in the topics under discussion. After the vapid talk of the guest at the sanitarium, I found the simple, interested discourse of these country people as stimulating as wine, and when I left them, it was with a hearty promise to renew my call at an early date.
"Better wait until after dark," Mr. Squires warned. "We'd be glad to see you any time, but we're so busy these fall days, we haven't much time for company." I took the broad hint in the same friendly spirit it was given. It must have grown chillier than I realized while I sat there, for my new friend's hands were clay cold when I took them in mine at parting. Homeward bound, a whimsical thought struck me so suddenly I laughed aloud. Ha ha ha! There was something suggestive of the dog tribe about the Squires family, though I could not, for the life of me, say what it was. Even Mildred, the daughter, beautiful as she was, with her light eyes, her rather prominent nose, and her somewhat wide mouth, reminded me, in some vague way, of a lovely silver collie I had owned as a boy. I struck a tassel of dried leaves from a cluster of weeds with my walking stick as I smiled at the fanciful conceit. The legend of the werewolf, those horrible monsters, formed as men
but capable of assuming bestial shape at will and killing and eating their fellows, was as old as mankind's fear of the dark. But no mythology I had ever read contained a reference to dog people. Strange fancies strike us in the moonlight sometimes. September ripened to October, and the moon, which had been as round and bright as an exchange-worn coin when I first visited the squire's house, waned as thin as a shaving from a silversmith's lathe. I became a regular caller at the house in the pines. Indeed, I grew to look forward to my nightly visits with those homely folk as a welcome relief from the tediously gay companionship of the over-sophisticated people at the sanitarium. My habit of slipping away shortly after dinner was the cause of considerable comment and no little speculation on the part of my fellow convalescents, some of whom set it down to the eccentricity which, to their minds, was the inevitable concomitant of a minister's vocation, while others were frankly curious. Snatches of conversation I overheard now and then led me to believe that the objective of my strolls was the subject of wagering, and the guarded questions put to me in an effort to solve the mystery became more and more annoying. I had no intention of taking any of them to the farmhouse with me. The squires were my friends. Their cheerful talk and unassuming manners were as delightful a contrast to the atmosphere of the sanitarium as a breath of mountain balsam after the fetid air of a hothouse. But to the city-centered crowd at Briarcliff, they would have been only the objects of less than half-scornful patronage, the source of pitying amusement. It was Miss Leahy who pushed the impudent curiosity further than any of the rest, however. One evening, as I was setting out, she met me at the gate and announced her intention of going with me.
You must have found something dreadfully attractive to take you off every evening this way, Mr. Weatherby,
she hazarded as she pursed her rather pretty, rouged lips at me and caught step with my walk.
We girls really can't let some little country lass take you away from us, you know. We simply can't.
I made no reply. It was scarcely possible to tell a pretty girl, even such a vain little flirt as Sarah Leahy, to go home and mind her business. Yet that was just what I wanted to do. But I would not take her with me. To that, I made up my mind. I would stop at the turn of the road, just out of sight of the farmhouse, and cut across the fields. If she wanted to accompany me on a cross-country hike in high-heeled slippers, she was welcome to do so. Besides, she would tell the others that my wanderings were nothing more mysterious than nocturnal explorations of the nearby woods, which bit of misinformation would satisfy the busybodies at Briarcliff and relieve me of the espionage to which I was subjected as well. I smiled grimly to myself as I pictured her climbing over fences and ditches in her flimsy party frock and beaded pumps, and lengthened my stride toward the woods at the road's turn. We marched to the limits of the field bordering the squire's grove in silence, I thinking of the mild revenge I should soon wreak upon the pretty little busybody at my side, Miss Leahy, too intent on holding the pace I set to waste breath in conversation. As we neared the woods, she halted, an expression of worry, almost fear, coming over her face.
I don't believe I'll go any farther,
she announced.
No, I replied, a trifle sarcastically. And is your curiosity so easily satisfied?
It's not that.
She turned half round as if to retrace her steps.
I'm afraid of those woods.
Indeed? I queried. And what is there to be afraid of? Bears? Indians? Or wildcats? I've been through them several times without seeing anything terrifying. Now she had come this far. I was anxious to take her through the fields and underbrush.
No,
Miss Leahy answered, a nervous quaver in her voice.
I'm not afraid of anything like that. But, I don't know what you call it. Pierre told me all about it the other day. Some kind of dreadful thing. Loop, something or other. It's a French word, and I can't remember it.
I was puzzled. Pierre Géronte was the ancient French-Canadian gardener at the sanitarium, and, like all doddering old men, would talk for hours to anyone who would listen. Also, like all habitants, he was full of the wild folklore his ancestors brought overseas with them generations ago. What did Pierre tell you? I asked.
Why, he said that years ago, some terrible people lived in these woods. They had the only house for miles round, and travelers stopped there for the night sometimes. But no stranger was ever seen to leave that place once he went in. One night the farmers gathered about the house and burned it with the family that lived there. When the embers had cooled down, they made a search and found nearly a dozen bodies buried in the cellar. That was why no one ever came away from that dreadful place. They took the murdered men to the cemetery and buried them. But they dumped the charred bodies of the murderers into graves in the barnyard without even saying a prayer over them. And Pierre says, "Oh, look!
She broke off her recital of the old fellow's story and pointed a trembling hand across the field to the edge of the woods. A second more, and she shrank against me, clutching at my coat with fear-stiffened fingers and crying with excitement and terror. I looked in the direction she indicated, myself a little startled by the abject fear that had taken such sudden hold on her. Something white and ungainly was running diagonally across the field from us, skirting the margin of the woods and making for the meadow that adjoined the sanitarium pasture. A second glance told me it was a sheep, probably one of the flock kept to supply our table with fresh meat. I was laughing at the strength of the superstition that could make the girl see a figure of horror in an innocent mutton that had strayed away from its fellows and was scared out of its silly wits, when something else attracted my attention. Loping along in the trail of the fleeing sheep, somewhat to the rear and a little to each side, were two other animals. At first glance, they appeared to be a pair of large collies, but as I looked more intently, I saw that these animals were like nothing I had ever seen before. They were much larger than any collie, nearly as high as St. Bernards, yet shaped in a general way like Alaskan sledge dogs, huskies. The farther one was considerably the larger of the two, and ran with a slight limp, as if one of its hind paws had been injured. As nearly as I could tell, in the indifferent light, they were a rusty brown color, very thick-haired and unkempt in appearance. But the strangest thing about them was the fact that both were tailless, which gave them a terrifyingly grotesque look. As they ran, a third form, similar to the other two in shape, but smaller, slender as a greyhound, with much lighter hued fur, broke from the thicket of short brush edging the wood and took up the chase, emitting a series of short, sharp yelps. Sheep killers, I murmured half to myself. Odd. I've never seen dogs like that before.
They're not dogs.
Wailed Miss Leahy against my coat.
They're not dogs. Oh, Mr. Weatherby, let's go away, please. Please take me home.
She was rapidly becoming hysterical, and I had a difficult time with her on the trip back. She clung whimpering to me, and I had almost to carry her most of the way. By the time we reached the sanitarium, she was crying bitterly, shivering as if with a chill, and went in without stopping to thank me for my assistance. I turned and made for the squire's farm with all possible speed, hoping to get there before the family had gone to bed. But when I arrived, the house was in darkness, and my knock at the door received no answer. As I retraced my steps to the sanitarium, I heard faintly from the fields beyond the woods the shrill, eerie cry of the sheep-killing dogs. A torrent of rain held us marooned the next day. Miss Leahy was confined to her room, with a nurse in constant attendance and the house doctor making hourly calls. She was on the verge of a nervous collapse, he told me, crying with a persistence that bordered on hysteria and responding to treatment very slowly. An impromptu dance was organized in the great hall and half a dozen bridge tables set up in the library. But as I was skilled in neither of these rainy day diversions, I put on a waterproof and patrolled the veranda for exercise. On my third or fourth trip around the house, I ran into old Gérant shuffling across the porch, wagging his head and muttering portentously to himself. "See here, Pierre," I accosted him. "What sort of nonsense have you been telling Miss Leahy about those pine woods down the south road?" The old fellow regarded me unwinkingly with his beady eyes, wrinkling his age-yellowed forehead for all the world like an elderly baboon inspecting a new sort of edible. "Monsieur goes out alone much at nights, n'est-ce pas?" he asked at length. "Yes, Monsieur goes out alone much at night," I echoed. "But what Monsieur particularly desires to know is what sort of tales you have been telling Mademoiselle Leahy. Comprenez-vous?" The network of wrinkles about his lips multiplied as he smiled enigmatically, regarding me askance from the corners of his eyes. "Monsieur is Anglais," he replied. "He would not understand or believe." "Never mind what I'd believe," I retorted. "What is this story about murder and robbery being committed in those woods? Who were the murderers, and where did they live? Huh?" For a few seconds he looked fixedly at me, chewing the cud of senility between his toothless gums, then glancing carefully about as if he feared being overheard. He tiptoed up to me and whispered, "Monsieur must stay indoors these nights. When the moon she shine, yes? When she not show her face, no. There are evil things abroad at the dark of the moon, monsieur. Even last night, they killed 3 of my beast sheep. Remember, monsieur, the loup-garou, he is out when the moon hide her light." And with that he turned and left me. Nor could I get another word from him, save his cryptic warning. "Remember, monsieur, the loup-garou, remember." In spite of my annoyance, I could not get rid of the unpleasant sensation the old man's words left with me. "The loup-garou," werewolf, he had said, and to prove his goblin wolf's presence, he had cited the death of his 3 sheep. As I paced the rain-washed porch, I thought of the scene I had witnessed the night before, when the sheep killers were at their work. Well, I reflected, I've seen the loup-garou on his native heath at last. From causes as slight as this, no doubt, the horrible legend of the werewolf had sprung. Time was when all France quaked at the sound of the loup-garou's hunting call, and the bravest knights in Christendom trembled in their castles and crossed themselves fearfully because some renegade shepherd dog quested his prey in the night. On such a foundation are the legends of a people built. Whistling a snatch from Pinafore and looking skyward in search of a patch of blue in the clouds, I felt a tug at my raincoat sleeve, such as a neglected terrier might give. It was Geraint again.
Monsieur,
He began in the same mysterious whisper.
the loup-garou is a verity, certainly. I myself have never seen him.
He paused to bless himself.
But my cousin, Baptiste, was once pursued by him. Yes, it was near the shrine of the good Saint Anne that Baptiste lived. One night he was sent to fetch the curé for a dying woman. They rode fast through the trees, the curé and my cousin, Baptiste, for it was at the dark of the moon, and the evil forest folk were abroad. As they galloped, there came a loup-garou from the woods, with eyes as bright as hellfire. It followed hard, this tailless hound, from the devil's kennel. But they reached the house before it, and the curé put his book, with the Holy Cross on its cover, at the doorstep. The loup-garou wailed under the windows like a child in pain until the sun rose. Then it slunk back to the forest. When my cousin Baptiste and the curé came out, they found its hand marks in the soft earth around the door. Very like your hand, or mine, they were, monsieur. Save that the first finger was longer than the others.
And did they find the loup-garou? I asked. Something of the old man's earnestness communicated to me.
Yes, monsieur, but of course,
he replied gravely.
3 weeks before a stranger drowned in the river had been buried without the office of the church. When they opened his grave, they found his fingernails as red as blood and sharp. Then they knew. The good curé read the burial office over him, and the poor soul that had been snatched away in sin slept peacefully at last.
He looked quizzically at me, as if speculating whether to tell me more. Then, apparently fearing I would laugh at his outburst of confidence, started away toward the kitchen. Well, what else, Pierre? I asked, feeling he had more to say.
No,
He replied.
there is nothing more, monsieur. I did but want monsieur should know my own cousin, that is Geraint, had seen the loup-garou with his very eyes.
Hearsay evidence, I commented as I went in to dinner. During the rainy week that followed, I chafed at my confinement, like a privileged convict suddenly deprived of his liberties, and looked as wistfully down the south road as any prisoned gypsy ever gazed upon the open trail. The quiet home circle at the farmhouse, the unforced conversation of the old folks, Mildred's sweet companionship, all beckoned me with an almost irresistible force. For in this period of enforced separation, I discovered what I had dimly suspected for some time. I loved Mildred Squires, and, loving her, I longed to tell her of it. No lad intent on visiting his first sweetheart ever urged his feet more eagerly than I when, the curtains of rain at last drawn up, I hastened toward the house
at the turn of the road. As I hoped, yet hardly dared expect, Mildred was standing at the gate to meet me as I rounded the curve, and I yearned toward her like a hummingbird seeking its nest. She must have read my heart in my eyes, for her greeting smile was as tender as a mother's as she bends above her babe.
"At last, you have come, my friend,"
she said, putting out both hands in welcome.
"I am very glad."
We walked silently up the path, her fingers still resting in mine, her face averted. At the steps, she paused, a little embarrassment in her voice as she explained.
"Father and Mother are out. They have gone to a meeting. But you will stay?"
"Surely," I acquiesced, and to myself I admitted my gratitude for this chance of Mildred's unalloyed company. We talked but little that night. Mildred was strangely distrait, and, much as I longed to, I could not force a confession of my love from my lips. Once, in the midst of a long pause between our words, the cry of the sheep killers came faintly to us, echoed across the fields and woods, and as the weird, shrill sound fell on our ears, she threw back her head with something of the gesture of a hunting dog scenting its quarry. Toward midnight, she turned to me, a panic of fear having apparently laid hold of her.
"You must go,"
she exclaimed, rising and laying her hand on my shoulder. "But your father and mother have not returned," I objected. "Won't you let me stay until they get back?"
"Oh, no, no,"
she answered, her agitation increasing.
"You must go at once, please."
She increased her pressure on my shoulder, almost as if to shove me from the porch. Taken aback by her sudden desire to be rid of me, I was picking up my hat when she uttered a stifled little scream and ran quickly to the edge of the porch, interposing herself between me and the yard. At the same moment, I heard a muffled sound from the direction of the front gate, a sound like a growling and snarling of savage dogs. I leaped forward, my first thought being that the sheep killers I had seen the other night had strayed to the squire's place. Crazed with blood, I knew they would be almost as dangerous to men as to sheep, and every nerve in my sickness-weakened body cried out to protect Mildred. To my blank amazement, as I looked from the porch, I beheld Mr. and Mrs. Squires walking sedately up the path, talking composedly together. There was no sign of the dogs or any other animals about. As the elderly couple neared the porch, I noticed that Mr. Squires walked with a pronounced limp, and that both their eyes shone very brightly in the moonlight, as though they were suffused with tears. They greeted me pleasantly enough, but Mildred's anxiety seemed increased rather than diminished by their presence, and I took my leave after a brief exchange of civilities. On my way back, I looked intently in the woods bordering the road for some sign of the house of which Pierre had told Miss Leahy, but everywhere the pines grew as thickly as thought. Neither axe nor fire had ever disturbed them. Geraint is in his second childhood, I reflected, and like an elder child, he loves to terrify his juniors with fearsome witch tales. Yet, an uncomfortable feeling was with me till I saw the gleam of the sanitarium's lights across the fields, and as I walked toward them, it seemed to me that more than once I heard the baying of the sheep killers in the woods behind me. A buzz of conversation like the sibilant arguments of a cloud of swarming bees, greeted me as I descended the stairs to breakfast next morning. It appeared that Ned, one of the pair of great mastiffs attached to the sanitarium, had been found dead before his kennel, his throat and brisket torn open, and several gaping wounds in his flanks. Boris, his fellow, had been discovered whimpering and trembling in the extreme corner of the doghouse, the embodiment of canine terror. Speculation as to the animal responsible for the outrage was rife, and, as usual, it ran the gamut of possible and impossible surmises. Every sort of beast, from a grizzly bear to a lion escaped from the circus, was in turn indicted for the crime, only to have a complete alibi straightway established. The only one having no suggestion to offer was old Geraint, who stood sphinx-like in the outskirts of the crowd, smiling sardonically to himself and wagging his head sagely. As he caught sight of me, he nodded sapiently, as if to include me in the joint tenancy to some weighty secret. Presently he worked his way through the chattering group and whispered,
"Monsieur, he was here last night, and with him was the other tailless one. Come and see."
Plucking me by the sleeve, he led me to the rear of the kennels, and stooping pointed to something in the moist earth.
"You see?"
he asked, as if a printed volume lay for my reading in the mud. "I see that someone has been on his hands and knees here," I answered, inspecting the handprints he indicated.
"Something?"
he corrected, as if reasoning with an obstinate child.
"Does not Monsieur behold that the first finger is the longest?"
"Which proves nothing," I defended. "There are many hands like that."
"Oh, yes,"
he replied with that queer upward accent of his.
"And where has Monsieur seen hands like that before?"
"Oh, many times," I assured him, somewhat vaguely, for there was a catch at the back of my throat as I spoke. Try as I would, I could recall only 3 pairs of hands with that peculiarity. His little black eyes rested steadily on me in an unwinking stare, and the corners of his mouth curved upward in a malicious grin. It seemed almost as if he found a grim pleasure in thus driving me into a corner. "See here, Pierre," I began testily, equally annoyed at myself and him. "You know as well as I that the loup-garou is an old woman's tale. Someone was looking here for tracks and left his own while doing it. If we look among the patients here, we shall undoubtedly find a pair of hands to match these prints."
"God forbid,"
he exclaimed, crossing himself.
"That would be an evil day for us, Monsieur." "Here, Boris,"
he snapped his fingers to the surviving mastiff.
"Come and eat."
The huge beast came wallowing over to him with the ungainly gait of all heavily muscled animals, stopping on his way to make a nasal investigation of my knees. Scarcely had his nose come into contact with my trousers when he leaped back, every hair in his mane and along his spine stiffly erect, every tooth in his great mouth bared in a savage snarl. But instead of the mastiff's fighting growl, he emitted only a low, frightened whine, as though he were facing some animal of greater power than himself, and knew his own weakness. "Good heavens!" I cried, thoroughly terrified at the friendly brute's sudden hostility.
"Yes, Monsieur,"
Geraint cut in quickly, putting his hand on the dog's collar and leading him a few paces away.
"It is well. You should call upon the heavenly ones, for surely you have the odor of hell upon your clothes."
"What do you mean?" I demanded angrily. "How
How dare you?
He raised a thin hand deprecatingly.
Monsieur knows that he knows,
He replied evenly,
and what I also know.
and leading Boris by the collar, he shuffled to the house. Mildred was waiting for me at the gate that evening, and again her father and mother were absent at one of their meetings. We walked silently up the path and seated ourselves on the porch steps, where the waning moon cast oblique rays through the pine branches. I think Mildred felt the tension I was drawn to, for she talked trivialities with an almost feverish earnestness, stringing her sentences together and changing her subjects as a Navajo rug weaver twists and breaks her threads. At last, I found an opening in the abatis of her small talk. "Mildred," I said very simply, for great emotions tear the ornaments from our speech. "I love you, and I want you for my wife. Will you marry me, Mildred?" I laid my hand on hers. It was cold as lifeless flesh and seemed to shrink beneath my touch. "Surely, dear, you must have read the love in my eyes," I urged as she averted her face in silence. "Almost from the night I first saw you, I've loved you, dear. Oh, don't." Her interruption was a strangled moan, as if wrung from her by my words. I leaned nearer her. "Don't you love me, Mildred?" I asked. As yet, she had not denied it. For a moment, she trembled, as if a sudden chill had come on her. Then, leaning to me, she clasped my shoulders in her arms, hiding her face against my jacket. John, you don't know what you say," she whispered disjointedly, as though a sob had torn the words before they left her lips. Her breath was on my cheek, moist and cold as air from a vault. I could feel the litheness of her through the thin stuff of her gown, and her body was as devoid of warmth as a dead thing. "You're cold," I told her, putting my arms shieldingly about her. "The night has chilled you." A convulsive sob was her only answer. "Mildred," I began again, putting my hand beneath her chin and lifting her face to mine. "Tell me, dear, what is the matter?" I lowered my lips to hers. With a cry that was half scream, half weeping, she thrust me suddenly from her, pressing her hands against my breast and lowering her head until her face was hidden between her outstretched arms. I, too, started back, for in the instant our lips were about to meet, hers had writhed back from her teeth like a dog's when he is about to spring, and a low, harsh noise, almost a growl, had risen in her throat. "For God's sake," she whispered hoarsely, agony in every note of her shaking voice. "Never do that again! Oh, my dear love, you don't know how near to a horror worse than death you were." Horror? Worse than death? I echoed dully, pressing her cold little hands in mine. "What do you mean, Mildred?" "Loose my hands," she commanded, with a quaint reversion to the speech of our ancestors. "And hear me. I do love you. I love you better than life, better than death. I love you so I have overcome something stronger than the walls of the grave for your sake. But John, my very love, this is our last night together. We can never meet again. You must go now, and not come back until tomorrow morning."
Tomorrow morning? I repeated blankly. What wild talk was this? Heedless of my interruption, she hurried on.
"Tomorrow morning, just before the sun rises over those trees, you must be here and have your prayer book with you."
I listened, speechless, wondering which of us was mad.
"By that corn crib there,"
she waved a directing hand.
"You will find 3 mounds. Stand beside them and read the office for the burial of the dead. Come quickly and pause for nothing on the way. Look back for nothing. Heed no sound from behind you. And for your own safety, come no sooner than to allow yourself the barest time to read your office."
Bewildered, I attempted to reason with the mad woman, begged her to explain this folly, but she refused all answer to my fervent queries, nor would she suffer me to touch her. Finally, I rose to go.
"You will do what I ask?"
she implored. "Certainly not," I answered firmly.
John, have pity!"
she cried, flinging herself to the earth before me and clasping my knee.
"You say you love me. I only ask this one favor of you, only this. Please, for my sake, for the peace of the dead and the safety of the living, promise you will do this thing for me."
Shaken by her abject supplication, I promised, though I felt myself a figure in some grotesque nightmare as I did it.
"Oh, my love, my precious love,"
she wept, rising and taking both my hands.
"At last I shall have peace, and you shall bring it to me."
"No," she forbade, as I made to take her in my arms at parting.
"The most I can give you, dear, is this."
She held her icy hands against my lips.
"It seems so little, dear, but oh, it is so much."
Like a drunkard in his cups, I staggered along the south road, my thoughts going wild with the strangeness of the play I had just acted. Across the clearing came the howls of the sheep killers, a sound I had grown used to of late. But tonight, there was a deeper, fiercer timbre in their bay, a note that boded ill for man as well as beast. Louder and louder it swelled. It was rising from the field itself, now drawing nearer and nearer the road. I turned and looked. The great beast I had seen pursuing the luckless sheep the other night were galloping toward me. A cold finger seemed traced down my spine. The scalp crept and tingled beneath my cap. There was no other object of their quest in sight. I was their elected prey. My first thought was to turn and run, but a second's reasoning told me this was worse than useless. Weakened with long illness, with an uphill road to the nearest shelter, I should soon be run down. No friendly tree offered asylum. My only hope was to stand and fight. Grasping my stick, I spread my feet, bracing myself against their charge. And as I waited their onslaught, there came from the shadow of the pines the shriller, sharper cry of the third beast. Like the crest of a flying, wind-lashed wave, the slighter, silver-furred brute came speeding across the meadow,
its ears laid back, its slender paws spurning the sod daintily. Almost it seemed as if the pale shadow of a cloud were racing toward me. The thing dashed slantwise across the field, its flight converging on the line of the other two's attack. Midway between me and them, it paused, hairs bristling, limbs bent for a spring. My eyes went wide with incredulity. It was standing in my defense. All the savageness of the larger beast hunting cry was echoed in the smaller creature's bay, and with it, a defiance that needed no interpretation. The attackers paused in their rush, halted, and looked speculatively at my ally. They took a few tentative steps in my direction, and a fierce whine, almost an articulate curse, went up from the silver-haired beast. Slowly, the tawny pair circled and trotted back to the woods. I hurried toward the sanitarium, grasping my stick firmly in readiness for another attack. But no further cries came from the woods, and once, as I glanced back, I saw the light-haired beast trotting slowly in my wake, looking from right to left, as if to ward off danger. Half an hour later, I looked from my window toward the house in the pines. Far down the south road, its muzzle pointed to the moon. The bright furred animal crouched and poured out a lament to the night, and its cry was like the wail of a child in pain. Far into the night, I paced my room, like a condemned convict when the vigil of the death watch is on him. Reason and memory struggled for the mastery, one urging me to give over my wild act, the other bidding me obey my promise to Mildred. Toward morning, I dropped into a chair, exhausted with my objectless marching. I must have fallen asleep, for when I started up, the stars were dimming in the zenith, and bands of slate, shading to amethyst, slanted across the horizon. A moment I paused, laughing cynically at my fool's errand, then seizing cap and book, I bolted down the stairs and ran through the paling dawn to the house in the pines. There was something ominous and terrifying in the two-tone pastel of the house that morning. Its windows stared at me with blank malevolence, like the half-closed eyes of one stricken dead in mortal sin. The little patches of hoarfrost on the lawn were like leprous spots on some unclean thing. From the trees behind the clearing, an owl hooted mournfully, as if to say, "Beware, beware!" And the wind soughing through the black pine boughs echoed the refrain ceaselessly. 3 mounds, sunken and weed-grown, lay in the unkempt thicket behind the corn crib. I paused beside them, throwing off my cap and adjusting my stole hastily. Thumbing the pages to the committal service, I held the book close, that I might see the print through the morning shadows, and commenced, "I know that my Redeemer liveth." Almost beside me, under the branches of the pines, there rose such a chorus of howls and yelps, I nearly dropped my book. Like all the hounds in the kennels of hell, the sheep killers clamored at me, raging fear and mortal hatred in their cries. Through the bestial cadences, too, there seemed to run a human note, the sound of voices heard before beneath these very trees, deep and throaty and raging mad. 2 of the voices came to me, and, like the tremolo of a violin lightly played in an orchestra of brass, the shriller cry of a third beast sounded.
As the infernal hubbub rose at my back, I half turned to fly. Next instant, I grasped my book more firmly and resumed my office. For like a beacon in the dark, Mildred's words flashed on my memory.
Look back for nothing. Heed no sound behind you.
Strangely, too, the den approached no nearer, but as though held by an invisible bar, stayed at the boundary of the clearing. Man that is born of a woman hath but a short time to live, and is full of misery. Deliver us from all our offenses. O Lord, deliver us not into the bitter pains of eternal death. And to such an accompaniment, surely, as no priest ever before chanted the office, I pressed through the brief service to the final Amen. Tiny gouts of moisture stood out on my forehead. My breath struggled in my throat as I gasped out the last word. My nerves were frayed to shreds, and my strength nearly gone as I let fall my book and turned upon the beast among the trees. They were gone. Abruptly, as it had begun, their clamor stopped, and only the rotting pine needles, lightly gilded by the morning sun, met my gaze. A light touch fell in the palm of my open hand, as if a pair of cool, sweet lips had laid a kiss there. A vapor like swamp fog enveloped me. The outbuildings, the old, stone-curbed well where I had drunk the night I first saw Mildred, the house itself, all seemed fading into mist and swirling away in the morning breeze. Hey! But Monsieur will do himself an injury sleeping on the wet earth. Orgerant bent over me, his arm beneath my shoulders. Behind him, great Boris, the mastiff, stood wagging his tail, regarding me with doggish good humor. Pierre, I muttered thickly, how came you here? This morning, going to my task, I saw Monsieur run down the road like a thing pursued. I followed quickly, for the woods hold terrors in the dark, Monsieur. I looked toward the farmhouse. Only a pair of chimneys, rising stark and bare from a crumbling foundation, were there. Fence, well, barn, all were gone, and in their place a thicket of sumac and briars, tangled and overgrown, as though undisturbed for 30 years. The house, Pierre! Where is the house? I croaked, sinking my fingers into his withered arm. House? He echoed. Oh, but of course, there is no house here, Monsieur, nor has there been for years. This is an evil place, Monsieur. It is best we quit it, and that quickly. There be evil things that run by night. No more, I answered, staggering toward the road, leaning heavily on him. I brought them peace, Pierre. He looked dubiously at the English prayer book I held. A Protestant clergyman is a thing of doubtful usefulness to the Orthodox French Canadian. Something of the heart-sick misery in my face must have touched his kind old heart, for at last he relented, shaking his head pityingly and patting my shoulder gently as one would soothe a sorrowing child. Perhaps, Monsieur, he conceded. Perhaps. Who shall say no? Love and sorrow are the purchase price of peace. Yes, did not Le Bon Dieu so buy the peace of the world? The Ghost Eater by cmeddyjr with hplovecraft. Moon madness? A touch of fever?
I wish I could think so. But when I am alone after dark, in the waste places where my wanderings take me, and hear across infinite voids the demon echoes of those screams and snarls and that detestable crunching of bones, I shudder again at the memory of that eldritch night. I knew less of woodcraft in those days, though the wilderness called just as strongly to me as it does now. Up to that night, I had always been careful to employ a guide, but circumstances now suddenly forced me to a trial of my own skill. It was midsummer in Maine, and despite my great need to get from Mayfair to Glendale by the next noon, I could find no person willing to pilot me unless I took the long route through Pottawisset, which would not bring me to my goal in time. There would be dense forest to penetrate. Yet, whenever I asked for a guide, I was met with refusal and evasion. Stranger that I was, it seemed odd that everyone should have such glib excuses. There was too much important business on hand for such a sleepy village, and I knew that the natives were lying, but they all had imperative duties, or said that they had, and would do no more than assure me that the trail through the woods was very plain, running due north, and not in the least difficult for a vigorous young fellow. If I started while the morning was still early, they averred, I could get to Glendale by sundown and avoid a night in the open. Even then, I suspected nothing. The prospect seemed good, and I resolved to try it alone. Let the lazy villagers hang back as they might. Probably, I would have tried it even if I had suspected. For youth is stubborn, and from childhood, I had only laughed at superstition and old wives' tales. So before the sun was high, I had started off through the trees at a swinging stride, lunch in my hand, Guardian automatic in my pocket, and belt filled with crisp bills of large denominations. From the distances given me and a knowledge of my own speed, I had figured on making Glendale a little after sunset. But I knew that even if detained overnight through some miscalculation, I had plenty of camping experience to fall back on. Besides, my presence at my destination was not really necessary till the following noon. It was the weather that set my plans awry. As the sun rose higher, it scorched through even the thickest of the foliage and burned up my energy at every step. By noon, my clothes were soaking with perspiration, and I felt myself faltering in spite of all my resolution. As I pushed deeper into the woods, I found the trail greatly obstructed with underbrush and, at many points, nearly effaced. It must have been weeks, perhaps months, since anyone had broken his way through, and I began to wonder if I could, after all, live up to my schedule. At length, having grown very hungry, I looked for the deepest patch of shade I could find and proceeded to eat the lunch which the hotel had prepared for me. There were some indifferent sandwiches, a piece of stale pie, and a bottle of very light wine. By no means
sumptuous fare, but welcome enough to one in my state of overheated exhaustion. It was too hot for smoking to be of any solace, so I did not take out my pipe. Instead, I stretched myself at full length under the trees when my meal was done, intent on stealing a few moments' rest before commencing the last lap of my journey. I suppose I was a fool to drink that wine, for, light though it was, it proved just enough to finish the work the sultry, oppressive day had begun. My plan called for the merest momentary relaxation, yet, with scarcely a warning yawn, I dropped off into a sound slumber. 2. When I opened my eyes, twilight was closing in about me. A wind fanned my cheeks, restoring me quickly to full perception, and as I glanced up at the sky, I saw with apprehension that black racing clouds were leading on a solid wall of darkness prophetic of violent thunderstorm. I knew now that I could not reach Glendale before morning, but the prospect of a night in the woods, my first night of lone forest camping, became very repugnant under these trying conditions. In a moment, I decided to push along for a while, at least, in the hope of finding some shelter before the tempest should break. Darkness spread over the woods like a heavy blanket. The lowering clouds grew more threatening, and the wind increased to a veritable gale. A flash of distant lightning illuminated the sky, followed by an ominous rumble that seemed to hint of malign pursuit. Then I felt a drop of rain on my outstretched hand, and though still walking on automatically, resigned myself to the inevitable. Another moment, and I had seen the light of a window through the trees and the darkness. Eager only for shelter, I hastened toward it. Would to God I had turned and fled! There was a sort of imperfect clearing, on the farther side of which, with its back against the primeval wood, stood a building. I had expected a shanty or log cabin, but stopped short in surprise when I beheld a neat and tasteful little house of 2 stories, some 70 years old by its architecture, yet still in a state of repair, betokening the closest and most civilized attention. Through the small panes of one of the lower windows, a bright light shone, and toward this, spurred by the impact of another raindrop, I presently hurried across the clearing, rapping loudly on the doors as soon as I gained the steps. With startling promptness, my knock was answered by a deep, pleasant voice which uttered the single syllable, "Gone." Pushing open the unlocked door, I entered a shadowy hall, lighted by an open doorway at the right, beyond which was a book-lined room with the gleaming window. As I closed the outer door behind me, I could not help noticing a peculiar odor about the house. A faint, elusive, scarcely definable odor which somehow suggested animals. My host, I surmised, must be a hunter or a trapper, with his business conducted on the premises. The man who had spoken sat in a capacious easy chair beside a marble-topped center table, a long, lounging robe of gray swathing his lean form. The light from a powerful argan lamp
threw his features into prominence, and as he eyed me curiously, I studied him in no less detail. He was strikingly handsome, with thin, clean-shaven face, glossy, flaxen hair, neatly brushed, long, regular eyebrows that met in a slanting angle above the nose, shapely ears set low and well back on the head, and large, expressive gray eyes, almost luminous in their animation. When he smiled a welcome, he showed a magnificently even set of firm white teeth, and as he waved me to a chair, I was struck by the fineness of his slender hands, with their long, tapering fingers, whose ruddy, almond-shaped nails were slightly curved and exquisitely manicured. I could not help wondering why a man of such engaging personality should choose the life of a recluse. Sorry to intrude, I ventured, but I've given up the hope of making Glendale before morning, and there's a storm coming on which sent me looking for cover. As if to corroborate my words, there came at this point a vivid flash, a crashing reverberation, and the first breaking of a torrential downpour that beat maniacally against the windows. My host seemed oblivious to the elements and flashed me another smile when he answered. His voice was soothing and well modulated, and his eyes held a calmness almost hypnotic.
You're welcome to whatever hospitality I can offer, but I'm afraid it won't be much. I've a game leg, so you'll have to do most of the waiting on yourself. If you're hungry, you'll find plenty in the kitchen, plenty of food, if not of ceremony. It seemed to me that I could detect the slightest trace of a foreign accent in his tone, though his language was fluently correct and idiomatic. Rising to an impressive height, he headed for the door with long, limping steps, and I noticed the huge, hairy arms that hung at his side in such curious contrast with his delicate hands.
Come, he suggested. Bring the lamp along with you. I might as well sit in the kitchen as here. I followed him into the hall and the room across it, and at his direction ransacked the woodpile in the corner and the cupboard on the wall. A few moments later, when the fire was going nicely, I asked him if I might not prepare food for both, but he courteously declined.
It's too hot to eat, he told me. Besides, I had a bite before you came.
After washing the dishes left from my lone meal, I sat down for a while, smoking my pipe contentedly. My host asked a few questions about the neighboring villages, but lapsed into sullen taciturnity when he learned I was an outsider. As he brooded there silently, I could not help feeling a quality of strangeness in him, some subtle alienage that could hardly be analyzed. I was quite certain, for one thing, that he was tolerating me because of the storm, rather than welcoming me with genuine hospitality. As for the storm, it seemed almost to have spent itself. Outside, it was already growing lighter, for there was a full moon behind the clouds, and the rain had dwindled to a trivial drizzle. Perhaps, I thought, I could now resume my journey after all, an idea which I suggested to my host. Better wait till morning, he remarked. You'll say you're afoot, and it's a good 3 hours to Glendale. I have 2 bedrooms upstairs, and you're welcome to one of them if you care to stay. There was a sincerity in his invitation which dispelled any doubts I had held regarding his hospitality, and I now concluded that his silences must be the result of long isolation from his fellows in this wilderness. After sitting without a word through 3 fillings of my pipe, I finally began to yawn. It's been rather a strenuous day for me, I admitted, and I guess I'd better be making tracks for bed. I want to be up at sunrise, you know, and on my way. My host waved his arm toward the door, through which I could see the hall and the staircase. Take the lamp with you, he instructed. It's the only one I have, but I don't mind sitting in the dark, really. Half the time, I don't light it at all when I'm alone. Oil is so hard to get out here, and I go to the village so seldom. Your room is the one on the right, at the head of the stairs. Taking the lamp and turning in the hall to say goodnight, I could see his eyes glowing almost phosphorescently in the darkened room I had left, and I was half reminded for a moment of the jungle and the circles of eyes that sometimes glow just beyond the radius of the campfire. Then I started upstairs. As I reached the 2nd floor, I could hear my host limping across the hall to the other room below, and perceived that he moved with owlish sureness despite the darkness. Truly, he had but little need of the lamp. The storm was over, and as I entered the room assigned me, I found it bright with the rays of a full moon that streamed on the bed from an uncurtained south window, blowing out the lamp and leaving the house in darkness but for the moonbeams. I sniffed at the pungent odor that rose above the scent of the kerosene, the quasi-animal odor I had noticed on first entering the place. I crossed to the window and threw it wide, breathing deep of the cool, fresh night air. When I started to undress, I paused almost instantly, calling my money belt still in its place about my waist. Possibly, I reflected, it would be well not to be too hasty or unguarded, for I had read of men who seized just such an opportunity to rob and even to murder the stranger within their dwelling. So, arranging the bedclothes to look as if they covered a sleeping figure, I drew the room's only chair into the concealing shadows, filled and lighted my pipe again, and sat down to rest or watch as the occasion might demand. 3. I could not have been sitting there long when my sensitive ears caught the sound of footsteps ascending the stairs. All the old lore of robber landlords rushed on me afresh, when another moment revealed that the steps were plain, loud, and careless, with no attempt at concealment, while my host's tread, as I had heard it from the head of the staircase, was a soft, limping stride. Shaking the ashes from my pipe, I slipped it in my pocket, then seizing and drawing my automatic, I rose from the chair, tiptoed across the room, and crouched tensely in a spot which the opening door would cover. The door opened, and into the shaft of moonlight stepped a man I had never seen before. Tall, broad-shouldered, and distinguished, his face half hidden by a heavy, square-cut beard, and his neck buried in a high black stock of a pattern long obsolete in America. He was indubitably a foreigner. How he could have entered the house without my knowledge was quite beyond me, nor could I believe for an instant that he had been concealed in either of the two rooms or the hall below me. As I gazed intently at him in the insidious moonbeams, it seemed to me that I could see directly through his sturdy form. But perhaps this was only an illusion that came from my shock of surprise. Noticing the disarray of the bed, but evidently missing the intended effect of occupancy, the stranger muttered something to himself in a foreign tongue and proceeded to disrobe. Flinging his clothes into the chair I had vacated, he crept into bed, pulled the covers over him, and in a moment or two was breathing with the regular respiration of a sound sleeper. My first thought was to seek out my host and demand an explanation, but a second later I deemed it better to make sure that the whole incident was not a mere delusive after effect of my wine-drugged sleep in the woods. I still felt weak and faint, and despite my recent supper, was as hungry as if I had not eaten since that noonday lunch. I crossed to the bed, reached out and grasped at the shoulder of the sleeping man. Then, barely checking a cry of mad fright and dizzy astonishment, I fell back with pounding pulses and dilated eyes. For my clutching fingers had passed directly through the sleeping form and seized only the sheet below. A complete analysis of my jarred and jumbled sensations would be futile. The man was intangible, yet I could still see him there, hear his regular breathing, and watch his figure as it half turned beneath the clothes. And then, as I was quite certain of my own madness or hypnosis, I heard other footsteps on the stairs, soft, padded, dog-like, limping footsteps, pattering up, 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 and again, that pungent animal smell, this time in redoubled volume. Dazed and dream-drowsed, I crept once more behind the protecting opened door, shaken to the marrow, but now resigned to any fate known or nameless. Then, into that shaft of eerie moonlight stepped the gaunt form of a great gray wolf. Limped, I should have said, for one hind foot was held in the air, as though wounded by some stray shot. The beast turned its head in my direction, and as it did so, the pistol dropped from my twitching fingers and clattered unheeded to the floor. The ascending succession of horrors was fast paralyzing my will and consciousness, for the eyes that now glared toward me from that hellish head were the gray, phosphorescent eyes of my host, as they had peered at me
through the darkness of the kitchen.
I do not yet know whether it saw me. The eyes turned from my direction to the bed and gazed gluttonously on the spectral sleeping form there. Then the head tilted back, and from that demon throat came the most shocking ululation I have ever heard. A thick, nauseous, lupine howl that made my heart stand still. The form on the bed stirred, opened his eyes, and shrank from what he saw. The animal crouched, quiveringly, and then, as the ethereal figure uttered a shriek of mortal human anguish and terror that no ghost of legend could counterfeit, sprang straight for its victim's throat, its white, firm, even teeth flashing in the moonlight as they closed on the jugular vein of the screaming phantasm. The scream ended in a blood-choked gurgle, and the frightened human eyes turned glassy. That scream had roused me to action, and in a second I had retrieved my automatic and emptied its entire contents into the wolfish monstrosity before me. But I heard the unhindered thud of each bullet as it embedded itself in the opposite wall. My nerves gave way. Blind fear hurled me toward the door, and blind fear prompted the one backward glance in which I saw that the wolf had sunk its teeth into the body of its quarry. Then came that culminating sensory impression and the devastating thought to which it gave birth. This was the same body I had thrust my hand through a few moments before. And yet, as I plunged down that black nightmare staircase, I could hear the crunching of bones. 4. How I found the trail to Glendale, or how I managed to traverse it, I suppose I shall never know. I only know that sunrise found me on the hill at the edge of the woods, with the steepled village outspread below me, and the blue thread of the Cataqua sparkling in the distance. Hatless, coatless, ashen-faced, and as soaked with perspiration as if I had spent the night abroad in the storm. I hesitated to enter the village till I had recovered at least some outward semblance of composure. At last, I picked my way downhill and through the narrow streets with their flagstone sidewalks and colonial doorways till I reached the Lafayette House, whose proprietor eyed me askance. "Where from so early, son? And why the wild look?" "I've just come through the woods from Mayfair." "You came through the Devil's Woods last night and alone?" The old man stared with a queer look of alternate horror and incredulity. "Why not?" I countered. "I couldn't have made it in time through Pottawisset, and I had to be here not later than this noon." "Last night was full moon. My God!" He eyed me curiously. "See anything of Vasily Ukranikov or the Count?" "Say, do I look that simple? What are you trying to do, jolly me?" But his tone was as grave as a priest as he replied, "You must be new to these parts, sonny. If you weren't, you'd know all about Devil's Woods, and the full moon, and Vasily, and the rest." I felt anything but flippant, yet knew I must not seem serious after my earlier remarks. "Go on. I know you're dying to tell me."
I'm like a donkey, all ears." Then he told the legend in his dry way, stripping it of vitality and convincingness through lack of coloring, detail, and atmosphere. But for me, it needed no vitality or convincingness that any poet could have given. Remember what I had witnessed, and remember that I had never heard of the tale until after I had had the experience and fled from the terror of those crunched phantom bones. There used to be quite a few Russians scattered betwixt here and Mayfair. They came after one of their nihilist troubles back in Russia. Vasily Ukranikov was one of them, a tall, thin, handsome chap with shiny yellow hair and a wonderful manner. They said, though, that he was a servant of the devil, a werewolf, and eater of men. He built him a house in the woods, about a third of the way from here to Mayfair, and lived all alone. Every once in a while, a traveler would come out of the woods with some pretty strange tale about being chased by a big gray wolf with shining human eyes like Ukranikov's. One night, somebody took a pot shot at the wolf, and the next time the Russian came into Glendale, he walked with a limp. That settled it. There wasn't any mere suspicion now, but hard facts. Then he sent to Mayfair for the Count. His name was Fyodor Chernevsky, and he had bought the old gambrel-roofed Fowler place up State Street. To come out and see him, they all warned the Count, for he was a fine man and a splendid neighbor, but he said he could take care of himself all right. It was the night of the full moon. He was brave as they make 'em, and all he did was to tell some men he had around the place to follow him to Vasily's. If he didn't show up in decent time, they did. And you tell me, Sonny, that you've been through those woods at night. Sure, I tell you. I tried to appear nonchalant. I'm no count, and here I am to tell the tale. But what did the men find at Ukranikov's house? They found the Count's mangled body, Sonny, and a gaunt gray wolf hovering over it with blood-slavering jaws. You can guess who the wolf was, and folks do say that at every full moon. But Sonny, did you see or hear anything? Not a thing, Pop. And say, what became of the wolf? Or Vasily Ukranikov? Why, son, they killed it, filled it full of lead and buried it in the house, and then burned the place down. You know all this was 60 years ago when I was a little shaver, but I remember it as if 'twas yesterday. I turned away with a shrug of my shoulders. It was all so quaint and silly and artificial in the full light of day. But sometimes, when I am alone after dark in waste places and hear the demon echoes of those screams and snarls and that detestable crunching of bones, I shudder again at the memory of that eldritch night.